All right. So with that, it's 9:05. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, good morning. My name is Heather Wendt. I'm with the Benton and Franklin Conservation Districts, and I'm the Heritage Garden Program Coordinator. And today I am joined by Alyssa Carlson with the Washington State Conservation Commission. Good morning, Alyssa.
Good morning, everyone. Excited to be here.
And I'm also joined by Ann Autry, who is our Yakima County Heritage Garden Program Coordinator. Good morning, Ann.
Hi, Heather. Hi, and everyone else. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited about this workshop. Great speakers here.
Yeah, we're very, very excited about this morning. And I want to just take a moment to thank our partners. This Heritage Garden program is brought to you in partnership by the Benton, Franklin, North Yakima, and South Yakima Conservation Districts, along with the Columbia Basin and Central Washington chapters of the Washington Native Plant Society. And again, this webinar is hosted in partnership with our wonderful partners at the Washington State Conservation Commission. Heritage Gardens in Yakima County are funded by the municipal subgroup of the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan through grant funding from the Washington State Department of Ecology. So all of these great entities coming together to offer you Heritage Gardens, and we thank everyone for their partnership and participation this morning. So with that, I want to throw it over to Ann Autry, who has a few quick announcements, and then Ann's going to introduce our next speaker. Ann?
Yeah, I do have a few quick announcements, and I'm going to show them on a screen, so just in case people want to be able to write down some information. The first thing is the North Yakima Conservation District is having a native plant sale this month, and scheduled for next month for May 22nd. And please watch their website for more details. It'll be an online sale, so you'll need to, I believe it'll be ordering online, and then you schedule a pickup. So anyway, so watch on their website for more information. Second, I want to remind everyone that our region is still in a drought. Most areas in the Columbia River Basin received 50 to 60% of the average precipitation this winter. If you planted native plants last fall or this spring, you need to make sure you give your plants water at least, about once a week through the summer to help them really survive our extreme heat. And especially since here we are hitting in the Tri-Cities, we're hitting 85 at the end of April. I'm kind of worried about what May and June are looking like. So just remember, our soils are very, very dry, and we just need to help those plants out a little bit. So just wanted to remind you that. Also, I am looking to certify Heritage Gardens in Yakima County. If you planted one from 2019, 2020, last year, and they're doing well, maybe about ready to bloom, please send me an email, and I can at ann-autry@conservelaw.net for more information, and or to set up an appointment for me to stop by quickly and certify your garden, give you a beautiful lawn sign that is very exclusive kind of thing, and so I hope you can see that on my page. And so is my page okay? There we go. And so anyway, so send me an email and let's set up an appointment. The fourth thing is, if you're looking to add new native plants or learn more about heritage garden plants, we still have the amazing plant selection guide, Heritage Gardens of the Columbia River Basin by Heather Wendt and Donna Lucas. And that is available for purchase for $27 from the Native Plant Society. You can contact me or Heather to find out how to get your own copy if you want to. Great book. And also, last but not least, today is Heather's birthday. So happy birthday, Heather, and best wishes to you.
Oh, Ann, I'm going to pay you back for that one. When's your birthday again? Next webinar. Stay tuned.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
no, thank you, everyone. Well, that's fantastic, Ann. Wonderful. Thank you for those messages. Sounds like we've got some exciting things coming up. And with that, I'll let you introduce our first speaker.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. That's me again. Okay. Wendy Gibble is our first speaker, and she is the manager of conservation and education at the University of Washington's Botanic Gardens, as well as the program manager for Washington's Rare Plant Care and Conservation Program. Wendy will present an overview of the conservation efforts to protect rare native plants, and she will introduce us to some of the rare plants of Washington.
Thank you very much, Anne.
You're welcome.
Thank you, and happy birthday, Heather. So thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's one of my favorite topics. I've been working on conservation of native plants in Washington for about the last 15 years. And what I have in my talk today is an overview of what makes a plant rare. What are rare plants? How do we define that and track those species in Washington state? And then give you an overview of some of the conservation activities we do with the Rare Plant Care and Conservation Program, or Rare Care for short. And then in the course of my talk, I will be introducing you to some of the rare plants with a focus on South Central Washington, so you can meet a few of the ones that you might find in your area. So let's start just with a definition of rarity. So rare species are those that have the state of low abundance and or small geographic range. And I have a couple, 3 examples here that will show different aspects of rarity. So on the left, I have the tufted evening primrose, and this is found in our state only, and this particular subspecies of this plant is found only in southeastern Washington in our state. It's far more common in southern Idaho, eastern Oregon, Nevada. And so we're at the very edge of its range. We're at the very northwest edge of the range. So that's one way that a species might be considered in our rare in our state, is that we're right at the edge of its range. This, of course, is important distinction because we consider it rare here in Washington state, whereas Oregon or someone in Idaho may say, oh no, that's real common. So rarity is a scale. It depends on what scale you are looking at. And we often, for our program, we are looking at what's rare in Washington state. The middle plant shown on this slide is Leaf Facilia, and it is known from only one population in our state, and that small annual that you see on the screen is about 2 inches tall, so it's a very small annual. It is found up on Table Mountain in Kittitas County, north of Ellensburg, and that's the only population. So it's a disjunct population. Again, it's more commonly found in the Intermountain West, where it would not be considered rare. So you can have populations that are disjunct or remnant, and this might have been more widespread at some different geologic age than the current one, but now this is all that remains for this species here in our state. And then on the right, you have another example of rarity, and this is Hoover's desert parsley, Lomation Tuberosum. Beautiful Lomation that you find on the talus slopes in only along sort of the Columbia River in Washington state. It's found nowhere else in the world. So it's an example of an endemic species, one of our very special endemic species. So that's some examples of rarity. And I will say that some of these endemic species, right when you get within the very limited habitat or range of the species, they can be quite abundant there. But because they have a very restricted geographic range, that's what makes them considered to be rare. So this is a great hand-drawn map that Dr. Art Krugerberg did. He was a faculty at University of Washington and studied rarity around not only the US, but other parts of the world. And what he has shown here is a markup of where we find endemic species in Washington. And the darkest patches that are black are where you have highest concentrations of endemic species. So you can see the Olympics are a hotspot for endemics. This is the section of the Columbia River. So we have a hotspot in this section. And then this is the Wenatchee Mountains. And the Wenatchee Mountains, of course, are different geology, and they have some really unique species there as well. So that gives you an idea of where you might find endemic plants in our state. And then if you look at the country, this is another map that shows species richness or high concentrations of biodiversity. With the red, the tighter the red lines, the more diverse area. And you can see California is a real hot spot for diversity in our country, as is southern Florida, the Panhandle, Florida, and this Nashville sort of region of the Appalachian Mountains. And then, of course, Hawaii, which isn't shown on here, but it also has a high level of endemic species. So unfortunately, we are continuing to see some imperilment of our rare plants. And this was a paper that was published back in 1998 that looked at what factors are causing imperiled species to be vulnerable to extinction. The greatest factor was habitat loss, which is this dark blue line, about 80% of the species that faced stresses due to habitat loss, but also non-native species, pollution, over-harvesting, and then to a lesser degree, diseases, and in some cases might be insects or fungus that is imported through the human activity. So when we look at our number of plants in Washington that are considered imperiled and rare, there's a couple different measures we can look at. The Washington Natural Heritage Program at the Department of Natural Resources is a non-regulatory body that tracks biodiversity in our state, and they maintain a list of sensitive plant species. And so the left side of this table is the Heritage Program's ranking of rare plants. And they use a classification system very similar to the Endangered Species Act, where they have plants that are endangered, plants that are threatened or sensitive. And you can see that they have about 51 that they considered endangered in our state, 142 threatened, and 148 sensitive. And then we have about 24 plants that are known to be extinct in our state. And then we have a review species for plants that are under consideration. So a total of 529 plants. That represents about 15% of our entire native flora in Washington state. So we consider about 15% to be rare. I will mention that our state does not have a state Endangered Species Act for plants. So just because a plant is considered endangered in Washington doesn't mean it has any legal protection. In fact, it doesn't give it any legal protection. So this is really more of a tool for assessing vulnerability than it is to confer any legal status. On the right side of this table is the federal status, and this is what species are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And we have not very many species. We have 4 that are considered endangered and 8 that are considered threatened, and no current candidate species. So only 12 plants in our state have legal protection, despite having potentially 15% of our flora being vulnerable to decline. I will say also, under the Endangered Species Act, that plants only have protection on federal lands or on for projects that are using federal money. So unlike animals, animals have protection on all lands under the federal, the Endangered Species Act. Plants only have protection on federal lands or federal projects. Now, there are some state, or not state, but local jurisdictions that do confer some conservation protections. For instance, in the Columbia River Gorge area, there's as a part of that designation, there is some local protections for plants. So it can really vary from place to place. Okay, so with that introduction, let me turn to our program, the Rare Plant Care and Conservation Program, or Rare Care. So we work statewide on conserving rare native plants, and I'm going to introduce you to some of the activities we do, including ex situ conservation, inventory and monitoring, research and reintroductions, and outreach. I have a picture here of one of our group of volunteers that trained several years ago, and I will want to really give a huge acknowledgement to the fabulous volunteers that we have working throughout Washington State on rare plant conservation. Our program is very much a volunteer-based program, and we have some local volunteers in the Benton County area that are doing fantastic work with us. So let me start with ex situ conservation. Ex situ means off-site, and it's when you hold a genetically representative collection of a species in a safe location in order to protect wild populations. So you can do this with living collections like you would find in an arboretum or a botanic garden. And we certainly at the Washington Park Arboretum in Seattle have a significant conservation collection with living trees and shrubs. You can do it with tissue culture. This might be really important when you have species that are no longer producing seeds, or you only have the male or the female left. This is the situation with some species in Hawaii. And then you have seed banks, and seed banks you have across the United States, and it's a very cost-effective way to do ex situ conservation. And this concept is a bit like the Noah's Ark concept of take these species, put them in a very secure location, and protect them in case their habitat or their populations are destroyed. We have then the opportunity to reintroduce these species back to the wild because we have these individuals in safe locations. So seed banking is actually the most cost-effective way to do ex situ conservation, and it is actually really taken advantage of a beautiful structure and purpose of the seed. And of course, the seed is the plant's way of providing sort of mobility and survival through harsh conditions for a plant, so that it will germinate at the appropriate time and in the appropriate habitat in many cases. So seeds are sort of a marvelous evolutionary life stage that we really take advantage of with seed banking, because seeds can tolerate desiccation, they can remain dormant for long periods of time, and of course they're tiny, and so we can store seeds in appropriate conditions. So what seeds, what some of the characteristics of seeds will control how they can be stored. So we sort of describe seeds based on how much they can tolerate desiccation. So orthodox seeds are ones that can tolerate desiccation, and many of our seeds in North America are orthodox, which is really good news because it turns out that orthodox seeds can be stored for very long periods of time. On the other hand, recalcitrant seeds are seeds that do not tolerate desiccation. And these are seeds that you would find with tropical species, large, tends to be seeds that have that are very large and have big endosperm. Some of our aquatic species are recalcitrant, and interestingly, some of our coastal rainforest species are recalcitrant. So these we would have to use special handling techniques. And then we have seeds that fall between those two extremes. We call them intermediate, and they also require some special handling. So we can, in our facility at the University of Washington, we have the Miller Seed Vault, which is a seed bank where we can store orthodox seeds. So again, orthodox being seeds that can be dried. And in our room, we will dry the seeds at about 15 degrees Celsius and 28 to 30% relative humidity. And in that condition, we drop the water content of the seed down quite low to less than 10%. And then we can freeze the seeds at that point. We're not going to damage the embryos, and the seeds can be then frozen and put into this commercial grade freezer you see in the picture. And we expect the longevity for seeds in a freezer is extremely variable, dependent on the species and perhaps some of the characteristics of its habitat and what it's adapted to. But for many species, we're expecting this to be decades or even longer. So it's a really cost-effective tool. And in a small freezer like this, you can store hundreds and thousands of individuals. And we currently, our collection right now, we have 142 species of rare plants preserved, and we have over 800,000 individuals preserved in our seed bank in just a very small space. And this is something that would be far more expensive to do for animals, of course, because you have to do have very sophisticated handling for the egg and the sperm. So for species, for plants, it's a very cost-effective tool. Our collections are done along maternal lines, meaning we keep the seeds from each individual plant separate in a small, we use corn envelopes when we make our collections. And we track our collections based on the individual plant and the population from which the collection was made. So here's a collection of Spalding's catchfly, which is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And we have volunteers who work in the seed vault, cleaning all the seeds by hand and packaging them up into these aluminum foil heat-sealed envelopes that we then put in the freezer, and that preserves the appropriate dry conditions for the seeds, and that's how we store them in the seed bank. And then we do germination testing of our seeds. We want to know what % of the seeds are viable, and we also want to figure out how to propagate these species. If we have to ultimately reintroduce them to the wild, we want to know how to handle these species. So we have an active program on germination testing. So let me turn to our rare plant monitoring project. And this goal of this project is to revisit the known occurrences of rare plants across the entire state to determine what their status is and to see how the populations are thriving. And this is a citizen science project. We have volunteers all across Washington State who participate in this program. And our volunteers attend a one-day training, and then they select what species and what site they want to visit. And we give them information from the Natural Heritage Program's database about a population and a map about where it is. And they head out, get to explore a new area, and collect some basic information on these populations. And this is providing tremendous information, not only to the Natural Heritage Program, but to all of the agencies who are managing these species across Washington State. We primarily work on public lands, but we also do work with some land trust. And all the reports that our volunteers submit to us, we share both with the Natural Heritage Program and with the agency partner where the population is located. So for instance, if we did some monitoring on the National Monument of Hanford Reach, we would then share it with U.S. Fish and Wildlife's office for the Hanford Reach. So it's an important tool we have for not only understanding the abundance and distribution of these species, but it's also what active management might be needed today to continue to protect these populations. So let me give you an example of a project we did about 5 years ago on gray cryptantha. And this is an endemic species to Washington State. It is found on sand deposits, sand dunes, and sandy soils along the Columbia River system. And you can see it here. This is a nice sand dune, and you can see here's a gray cryptantha right here. And so we were noticing as our volunteers were monitoring these populations that the numbers were coming back quite small compared to what historical records suggested, and some of the populations were not being found. So here is the distribution of gray cryptantha with the red dots showing where it had been recorded from historically. And I've circled the 6 areas where we knew historically there were populations of 1,000 or more individuals. So this is Juniper Dunes down in Franklin County, the large dune field on the Hanford site, above the White Bluffs, there's some dunes, there's the potholes area up in Grant County. So we had about 6 areas where we knew we had very large populations of the species historically. And then we had volunteers and staff going out across the state over several years and revisiting all known sites that we could access on public land. Some of these were private lands. And here's what we found. We found that the Juniper Dunes population appears to be gone. We're going to still take another look at that, but it seems to have disappeared. The population on the Hanford site is robust and thriving, and probably tens of thousands of plants. The population that's above the White Bluffs is probably less than 200 at this time, and about 400 near Priest Rapids, and still more than 2,000 plants up in the potholes. So we certainly have seen some impact to these populations and a decline. And based on this work, the Heritage Program changed the status of gray cryptantha in Washington State from sensitive to threatened, because we are seeing a decline across its range. So let's look at some of the numbers. We had 1/4 of the sites that were not relocated. 1/4 of the sites held less than 50 individuals. And then we had 8 sites that had 50 to 500 and 3 sites that had more than 1,000 individuals. So quite a decline from what the historic numbers had. So let me show you some of the pictures of the habitat. This is on the Hanford site, and very large dune field there. We had really good habitat condition. We found a very thriving dune, sand dune ecosystem there. And again, tens of thousands of plants. Looking close up into some of those areas, you had good diversity of native species, and you can see very little cheatgrass in here. Here's a little bit right here, but generally very good condition. So then let's look at the area just south of Priest Rapids Dam. These are sand deposits, and this is choked with cheatgrass. And that we found in quite a few places we looked for this species. Here's the potholes. And what we saw in the potholes is a lot of encroachment of other species, in this case, some shrub encroachment, rabbit brush. And then we're also seeing a crust on the sand deposits, which is suggesting that the sand might be getting stabilized, which is will just facilitate more other plants getting established and may not be good in the long run for the gray cryptantha. And then down at Juniper Dunes, we saw what we did not find any plants, and this white marker here was an old BLM monitoring point for this species, and things were really, really dry at Juniper Dunes. It just, the sand was really dry, everything was really dry. And my hypothesis there is that we have a long, prolonged drought that has impacted the populations there, and that population no longer exists. And it was reportedly very common in thousands of plants. So that gives you a sort of an overview of how we do our monitoring. Many volunteers contributed to this effort, what information came out of it, and it touches on some of the challenges we're seeing with these plants. Our sand dunes have been impacted by off-road vehicles. We've had changes in sand deposition due to the damming of the Columbia River, and that's probably having a significant effect. We're having regional droughts, and that could be climate change. And then we have invasion of cheatgrass, which is really affecting a lot of these systems as well. So all factors are challenging for this particular species. So over the course of our 21 years that we've been running the Citizen Science Program, we've trained over 400 volunteers statewide. Over 40,000 hours of have been contributed by our volunteers. They've done over 2,000 assignments and visited over 1,000 populations or occurrences of rare plants. And of course, as they become familiar with these rare species, we are finding new populations, documenting new populations, because they now know who they are, which is a great contribution of this project. And let me then touch to a couple projects we have going on right now in your area. So Rare Care does do some research and reintroductions with our federal partners. And we're working on a project at Hanford Reach right now on the White Bluff splatterpot, which is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. It's known from this one population on the White Bluffs. You can see it all in bloom right here. And work at Hanford Reach by Heidi Newsom and Jane Abel had been very successful with doing some experimental outplantings by growing plugs in a nursery and then planting them out. So we wanted to see if direct seeding would be a different and successful tool for establishing new populations with this species. So we have set up some seeding plots out at the White Bluffs, and we're seeding in 300 seeds into these plots over a 2-year period, 2 or 3 year period, and then checking germination and seeing how much plant establishment. And of course, that will be a great tool for us to reintroduce this species with direct seeding if it's successful, because it's a lot easier and less labor intensive to do than to try to outplant plants that are grown in a nursery, which can require some watering during the first year. So we're in, as I said, we're about 2 years into that study. We'll continue to be monitoring germination here over the next few years to see how successful that is. And then another project that we're just starting is on the Umptenum desert buckwheat. This is another species that is listed as threatened on the Endangered Species Act, and it occurs on a closed portion of the Hanford site and is known from one population. And it's a small shrubby buckwheat that you see here. It occurs on this one ridge line on Umptenum Ridge, and it had a pretty sizable population, but a couple recent wildfires in the last decade has really been impactful and destroyed quite a bit of the population. So wildfire, which of course is becoming more frequent, and with the extensive stand of cheatgrass that has developed in our sagebrush, the cheatgrass is really promoting hotter fires, and they're racing across much of the landscape, and that's, as I'm sure all of you know, really decimating our shrub steppe communities. And this particular species is a very slow-growing, long-lived perennial, and likely has very infrequent years of plant establishment. It's a very harsh site, very windy, very dry, and seedling recruitment and plant recruitment, we don't know exactly what conditions it needs to establish, but we're not seeing significant plant establishment or new plants being recruited in. And with the loss of a significant portion of the population in this last wildfire, it has really imperiled this species. So this is going to be a project we're just starting up with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and we're looking at several aspects. We're doing a seedling study where we're looking at the microsites for the seedling, and we're going to be doing some manipulation of the seedling sites by doing some hand watering of seedlings to see if we can establish some through the season. So for instance, we noted at the beginning of this webinar that you've got a significant drought occurring this year, and there's been a number of years like that, and the seedlings really are likely not surviving these dry conditions, but that's the hypothesis we want to test. We want to see if we can add supplemental watering and see if we can establish plants. We're also going to be clipping cheatgrass to see if we can reduce competition with cheatgrass and whether that helps, and then look at where they are establishing, what sites are best for establishment, and that's going to really help us with future introduction and reintroductions to try to figure out exactly what sites these plants need to get established. Once established, they are very long-lived. We think they can live up to 100 years. Another aspect of our study will be to look at the soil environment of this species, and trying to figure out if it requires a very specific soil chemistry or physical structure. Again, Heidi Newsom and Jane Abel had done some experimental outplantings with the species at other sites in the basin that have not been very successful, and it's not clear at this point whether why we haven't had success. So we're going to try. We're looking at soil to see if there is something unique that it needs in the soil, as well as we're going to try an experimental outplanting right here adjacent to the natural population to see if we can have more success in the native soils. So that'll be something that we'll be doing the outplanting in the fall of 2021 and then watering it in the fall of 2022. So, or through the next year of 2022. So we're really excited to get to start that work out at Hanford as well. So let me just wrap up by talking a little bit about plant conservation across the country and in our state. There's a lot of needs we have with plant conservation. Funding is, of course, one of the biggest one. Most of the federal money available for these projects go for the species listed under the Endangered Species Act, and available money for working on other species that may not be listed is very much limited, and that is really challenging because there's some species in the state that are, should be considered for the Endangered Species Act, but until that time, they don't get much attention. Advocacy is really needed. Public involvement, letting our local representatives, our state representatives know that native plants are important and that native protecting habitat where they occur is very important. We need more expertise. We need more botanists in public agencies and in the field, and we're sadly going in the opposite direction. We're continue to lose botanists positions across the country, and many botany programs at universities actually have been subsumed into biology programs. So we actually are losing expertise when we really want to be gaining expertise. We need more ex situ storage of genetic resources. As I said, we've banked around 142 of our species, but there's potentially hundreds more to be conserved. We continue to work on techniques to successfully propagate and restore the rare plants, and a lot more work is needed there. And then actually doing outplantings and restoring wild populations can be very labor and cost intensive, but needed as more and more of these species face pressures in their habitat. And then, of course, we need long-term management of these lands to secure their future, not only for these plants, but for all the species that co-occur with them and rely on these species to survive. These plants are just a piece of the ecological puzzle in the habitat where they occur. So you can help by learning about your native flora, and I think you're all interested if you're attending this lecture, which is fabulous. Please volunteer for local activities, whether it's invasive species removal or restoration plantings or monitoring rare plants. Learn about what species are invasive and please remove them from your gardens if you have them. Share what you know and your enthusiasm with friends and children. Introduce children to the wonders of the plant world and build a new conservationist. And as I said, advocate with your local representatives and support your local conservation programs. And I'm going to finish up here with a quick guide or some guidelines for growing native plants. It is super fun to grow native plants. I love to do it, and I will often collect seeds and try to grow some in my yard. So I do have a couple of guidelines I ask you to follow. First, do no harm to rare native plants, and please don't collect seeds from plants that are considered sensitive, threatened, or endangered. You can go to the Washington Natural Heritage Program website on DNR, and it's just the NHP list, and you will get a full list of species that are considered sensitive in Washington state. And we ask that you not grow these species in your garden. So that's just, don't collect seeds from them, and please consider, there's so many other beautiful plants to grow, to not put an impact and collect seeds from this rare plants. When you are collecting seeds, a good guidelines are do not collect more than 10% of the ripe seeds that are available on your day of collection. You do not want to take the next generation away from that wild population, leave it there for a healthy recruitment for the next season. You don't know anything about the size of the seed bank when you're making a collection, so just make a very conservative assumption that there is no seed bank and stick to a very small collection from that wild population. And then don't collect more than 10% of the seeds from any single plant. So we don't want to take any particular plant out of the gene pool for the next generation. And especially in the dry area where in your part of the state, it could be that this crop of seeds, you might have a very wet season next year, and it might be the 1 year in 30 years that plants can establish, that we're going to have enough moisture for plants to get established. And so if you've collected a lot of seeds the year before, you might have really impacted that species opportunity to take advantage of the best year in 30 years. So keep that in mind when you make your collections. And then finally, if you're out on public lands, you'll want to know what permissions you need for making a seed collection. Many public lands you can if you get a permit, but just be aware of that. The permits are generally inexpensive, but some lands it's not permissible. So you can check in with your local contacts about that. And just want to end, I just have a thank you to our partners. We partner with many federal and state agencies, the Washington Natural Heritage Program, and a wonderful thanks to our volunteers all over Washington State who make our work possible. And then we also are funded by many different private and private foundations, federal agencies, and private donors, and I really want to thank them for their support. And so with that, I would be happy to answer questions, and I have not been looking at questions. So I'm hoping someone, if there is, can help me with that.
Wendy, thank you. That's a wonderful presentation. And I think, Alyssa, we probably have a few questions, don't we?
We do, yes. Thank you for that very important presentation. That was fantastic. We have a question here. Well, it's a series of 3 questions, so just let me know if you need me to repeat any of them, but they're all related. How do you maintain the preserved collection as the seeds age? Do you plant what you have and hope to harvest new seeds, or search for more plants in the wild?
Okay, great questions. That's a really good question about aging seeds in the seed bank. And we're just starting a project with the Center for Plant Conservation, and that's a national nonprofit located down in San Diego that all of our botanic gardens who have seed banks, we all are members of the Center for Plant Conservation Network. So we all work together on how to bank seeds. And we're just starting a study with them and the National Laboratory for Genetic Resource Preservation, which is located in Fort Collins, Colorado, and that's where our entire food supply is backed up in this Department of Agriculture facility. So they're the experts on seed banking, and we're actually taking collections out of our seed banks that are 15, 20 years old or older and sending them to the national lab to look at aging of seeds. And so it's a big question, and it's very hard for us to know because, first of all, a lot of our ex situ collections are quite small because these populations, these are rare plants, and they don't have a lot of seeds available. So sometimes we only have collections of a couple hundred seeds, and we can't sit there and continually test them to see if they're still viable. And the other challenge we have is that the viability doesn't drop off like in a linear fashion over time. They tend to stay viable with very little loss of viability over time, and then all of a sudden they hit a drop off and you lose viability. And it's really hard to know when that happens. So we don't know, but we are researching that, and we do know that for some species we're nowhere near the aging yet for them. When we do have to replace them, the preference will be to recollect from wild populations, because those wild populations is where the species is continuing to adapt and evolve with changing climatic conditions. And so we want those genetic resources, we want the wild populations. In some cases, they might be gone. And if that's the case, then yeah, we would look at doing a grow out in a garden setting and use that tool. But again, the challenge is catching that before we lose viability, and that's a big question that we're still working on. Did I get all those questions?
I believe so. Thank you. That was great. Yeah. We've got another question here. Well, a comment and a question. Thank you, Wendy. Go Huskies. Right. What is your knowledge? What is your knowledge of the conservation restoration work going on after the 2020 wildfires in the Yakima River Canyon and surrounding areas?
Oh boy, I'm not familiar with in the Yakima Canyon. I am not familiar with what work is going on there. That's not an area that I've been doing a lot of work, and I have not heard that, and my focus tends to be rare plants. I've not heard that there's been significant impact to rare plants there. Not to say it hasn't, I just haven't heard. So I can't really speak to that. I do know that in other areas, we've had some really bad wildfire seasons, as everybody knows. We are certainly looking at that for rare plants, for instance, in the Eriogonum, the Umptenum desert buckwheat site, and also a project we are working on with BLM up in Wenatchee on whited milkvetch, which is a species that likely should be listed under the Endangered Species Act, and its population has seen 3 wildfires in 10 years, and it's just really been devastating. So yeah, sorry, I can't specifically address that area.
That's all right. I do believe I've seen just in my other communication circles, I think the Audubon Society was involved with some conservation restoration work in there, I believe I've seen. So maybe someone like Kittitas Audubon or other Audubon groups might know, or maybe the local native plant society.
Very good. Any other questions? If you have a question, just a reminder to type it in the questions box. And so Wendy, are you going to stay on for a while, or are you headed out to the field?
I'm going to stay on a little bit, but won't be with you the whole day, the whole morning.
Okay.
So yeah.
No worries. If anyone else, yes, wonderful presentation. So if you have a question for Wendy, we'll try to get to it before the next break. But otherwise, Wendy, phenomenal presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I think we'll go ahead, and Anne, would you like to introduce our next speaker? So we'll do one more presentation and then we'll take a break. But Anne, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather, and thank you, Wendy. That was a phenomenal presentation. Really enjoyed it. Our next speaker is Marianne Tompkins. She has worked in the commercial landscaped industry for 30 years. She currently spends her time as an organic landscape consultant, a certified habitat steward with the National Wildlife Federation, and a certified Landscapes for Life teacher. Marianne is going to educate us on how to create a truly sustainable landscapes by learning how to reduce, reuse, and recycle in the garden. Take it away, Marianne.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Anne. I appreciate it. And I really want to thank everybody, all the gardeners and landscapers and everybody that's interested in a healthier planet for being on this webinar. But this presentation is based mostly on the Sustainable Sites Initiative, and that is a partnership that is led by the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and the United States Botanic Garden. It's the nation's first voluntary rating system for sustainable land design, construction, and maintenance practices. So as sites guidelines become accepted practices, they'll transform the ways we design and build on the land, creating landscapes that nourish life for generations to come. So reducing, reusing, and recycling are sustainable practices, with reducing being the highest priority, reducing our consumption of natural resources. Why is sustainability so important? Well, 100 years ago, we were at 1.6 billion people on this planet. Today, we're at 7.8 billion. So as human populations increase, there's unprecedented pressure that's being placed on our planet's soils, our waters, forests, and other natural resources. And it is projected that under the current business as usual scenario, humanity is going to need the capacity of 2 Earths by the year 2030 to absorb CO2 waste and keep up with natural consumption. So this concept of sustainability is really a dynamic balance between 3 factors: First being our planet. Our lives and the lives of other creatures depend upon our natural environment and the goods and services it provides, such as clean air, clean water, habitat, erosion control, food, timber, and other materials. Now, sustainable gardens protect and restore the land's ability to provide these benefits for current and future generations. Now, so sustainable landscapes, they weigh decisions according to their long-term environmental and human health impacts, as well as financial benefits, because we all know that any successful project has to certainly be economically feasible. However, putting profit, it's not the only issue to consider, because by placing economic gains or financial savings at the forefront of our decision making has really led to significant environmental and human health costs. So take, for example, the practice of clear-cut logging. It's an economical but very destructive practice. Or the drainage of flood-controlling wetlands along rivers to accommodate agriculture and urban development. So we gain a better sense of the full cost of doing business when the impacts on people and the planet are included in our accounting. And then in turn, we're encouraged to act in a manner that's more socially and environmentally responsible. And then people, well, the health and well-being of people are central to the concept. So when our planet and soils are healthy, we're healthy. We are all connected. And sustainable gardens will improve our physical, mental, and social well-being. So another major change that's occurred is the migration of population from rural to urban. So 80% of the population in the US live in urban areas where their interactions with nature and the benefits that these interactions provide commonly occur in small-scale sites or residential settings. Now, unfortunately, the individual impacts of these sites, positive or negative, are often overlooked or considered so small they're not worth considering. So we can't think that we can't make a big difference, because gardeners and landscapers actually do hold the power for change. When we share the story of sustainability in our practices with our neighbors, it encourages others to do the same. We start the conversation and collectively we make a big impact. And it's really empowering to know that you're part of the solution. Now, reducing water waste and consumption is critical. So much of the earth is covered with water. It's sometimes called the water planet. About 97% of the water is ocean salt water. Most fresh water is locked up in the polar ice cap. So there's only 0.003% of the Earth's water that's available for human consumption, our drinking water. Clean water shortages are quickly becoming one of the most urgent challenges facing humanity. In the US, 36 of the 50 states anticipate freshwater shortages within the next 10 years. Americans, well, we apply more than 7 billion gallons of water a day outdoors. And stormwater runoff from gardens and lawns is a major source of water pollution. So again, residential properties are part of the solution. So this population growth really becomes a little more relevant when you look at maps like this one, with the percentages being the estimated population growth in the next 9 years. And the colors indicate water use in gallons per day per person. So the states with the largest population growth are also the states with the greatest water use. You begin to wonder where all these people are going to get their water. And in Washington state alone, we're projected to be at 46% by the year 2030. So water, it not only supports our natural environment, right? But it's essential to our human survival. It's our livelihoods. It's in almost every form of economic production. It's required for producing food, clothing, and electronics. Water transports our waste, and water is a finite resource. So what contributes to water shortages? The planting of species not suited to local precipitation patterns, wasteful irrigation practices, degraded soil conditions that limit the infiltration and water holding capacity of the soil, such as compaction and the continuous removal of organic matter. Paving roofs and other impervious surfaces that prevent water from infiltrating into the soil and recharging groundwater supplies. And treating stormwater as waste and funneling it to storm sewers before it has an opportunity to benefit the landscape. I mean, instead of capturing and using stormwater in our gardens, we have created an entire infrastructure of gutters, downspouts, and sewers to rapidly transport it off-site. So landscapes play a major role. Lawn irrigation consumes up to 60% in the West. Majority of our irrigation comes from municipal drinking water. So under the current policy in Washington State, you do not need a water right permit to collect rainwater, with a few conditions. Rainwater must be used on the property where it's collected. Rainwater can only be collected from existing structures that have another purpose other than collecting rainwater, such as your roof. And pictured here is a cistern, and the cisterns can hold 200 to more than 1,000 gallons. Rain barrels generally hold around 50 to 70 gallons, and they come with a screen cover and an overflow spout. Approximately 600 gallons of water can be collected for each inch of rain falling on 1,000 square foot of impervious catchment surface, like your roof. And you really will be shocked at how much rain you collect in a short amount of time when you do finally get that rain. And it's a beautiful sound when it hits those barrels in more ways than one. So pictured here are 70-gallon rain barrels. And we installed 7 of these, so that's 142 gallons. These rain barrels were previously food containers that held onions. You never want to use a container that had any toxic materials. Now, air conditioner condensate recovery systems are great, especially in eastern Washington. Condensate is best produced when warm and humid air passes over the coils of an air conditioning system. And collecting condensate is attractive because, unlike rain, which is sporadic and unpredictable, condensate's produced regularly during the hottest months when the need for irrigation is greatest. So an air conditioner condensate it's essentially distilled water that doesn't contain chlorine, minerals, or other additives. So it makes it a really high quality water source for irrigation. And since rainwater harvesting and condensate recovery systems use similar tanks for storage, they can be combined to create a more efficient system and to really reduce costs. And if you think about it, the average single family home produces 5 to 10 gallons of condensate per day when in use. Now, an estimated 50 to 80% of residential wastewater is dish, shower, sink, and laundry water. That's the gray water. Reducing gray water, or reusing gray water, serves 2 purposes. It reduces the amount of fresh water needed to supply a household, and it reduces the amount of wastewater entering sewer or septic systems. Now, if you live in a drought-affected part of the country, it saves precious drinking water. So many people love using gray water as an option because it does provide that steady water source year-round, and it saves potable water resources. It can be stored in a cistern or rain barrels for the dry season. Gray water really is used to grow beautiful gardens. However, direct human contact, using it in vegetable gardens, or even brand new installs should be avoided. The rules to allow gray water use took effect in Washington State July 31, 2011, and local health jurisdictions had 3 years to implement. So states and local governments regulate gray water differently. and some prohibit the collection of gray water entirely. So in regions or counties where gray water use or rainwater harvesting, but rainwater harvesting isn't an issue in Washington State, but in counties where it's not a legal option, homeowners can educate local officials on the benefits of water reuse and encourage policy change. So I'd start by asking your local health department if gray water is allowed. So let's move on to materials and product selection. So I can't encourage enough to use local mulch. I used to use peat mulch many, many years ago until I learned that peat moss sold in the United States comes from the sphagnum moss bogs of Canada. And peat bogs, like other wetlands, are nature's water purifiers. They contribute to our safe drinking water. They filter an estimated 10% of global freshwater resources. They provide effective flood prevention. So destroying a bog destroys these benefits. And perhaps the biggest contribution of peat bogs to a healthy environment is as global coolers. They help to fight climate change. So make your own mulch with materials from your own yard. Applying mulch helps prevent erosion. It shades soils to conserve water, minimizes soil compaction in areas of high foot traffic. And most gardeners know that when mulch is applied to a landscape, one of nature's fundamental processes is being mimicked. Consider what happens in a deciduous forest. It's one of nature's champion mulchers. The leaves shed. In autumn, they're transformed by the soil's natural food web into plant food. And that rich organic matter is the key to maintaining healthy soil. I do want to give a little shout out to our ground nesting bee species. So when spreading mulch, it's really important to remember that approximately 70% of native bee species nest in the ground. And ground nesting bees prefer undisturbed, bare areas of soil for nesting. So mulch can prevent bees from coming into contact with the soil and excavating a tunnel. So to support these bees in your garden, leave small patches of soil bare in areas that aren't often used by people or pets and don't need to be protected from erosion. And you don't want any organic matter in those areas of your garden either. And they're just the cutest little bees. I have them in my yard and they just pop their heads up at the surface of their tunnel. They're very cute. You'll love having them. So different organic mulch types, leaves, they make a great mulch and they are the alternative to peat moss. They're free. Partially shredded leaves are less likely to mat and shed water than whole leaves, so run them through a shredder or pass a mower over them a few times before mulching to produce a better mulch. And then bark, because they're a recycled byproduct of the lumber industry, they are preferable to wood chips, which may be made from trees that are felled solely for the manufacture of mulch. So look for products, if you're buying, expressly labeled bark mulch, not just wood or hardwood mulch. Now, Arborist chips are my go-to, my absolute favorite. And when they're obtained from local arborists who create them from their daily pruning, Arborist chips are a great choice, and they're available for free where I live. I just tip the driver. Pine needles, they're light and fluffy. They don't get compacted, so water penetrates easily. Sometimes they tend to lower soil pH, so they're best used around acid-loving plants. Now, nutshells, if nutshells are an agricultural byproduct in the area, they're a good choice. Shells tend to look a bit more formal than other mulches. You just want to be aware of cocoa hulls. It's a byproduct of chocolate processing, which contain compounds that are toxic to dogs. Straw. So straw is an effective mulch, but be sure you get straw and not hay, which is full of weed seeds. Straw, in my opinion, isn't very attractive in planting beds, but it looks appropriate in vegetable gardens. So. Now, converting green waste into compost. It's important. Let's avoid synthetic fertilizers. The use of synthetic fertilizers are considered unsustainable. They're made from fossil fuels. And there's a lot, I could say a ton on this, but in short, synthetic fertilizers can harm the environment because their nitrogen and phosphorus levels are often higher. Phosphorus runoff from farms and landscapes that use fertilizers been disastrous to aquatic life and our salmon. So the native plants of the Columbia Basin, they're very adapted to the natural basin soils, as most native plants are to their native soils. So if you add amendments when your soils don't need them, it can harm your native plants. So have a soil test first, and that helps you in selecting plants that are going to do best for your site. But compost is always ideal for vegetable gardens. And the same natural recycling that happens every day in nature is at work in a compost pile. Decomposition, it takes years in nature, but when you compost, you're giving that fungi, bacteria, and nature's other decomposers everything they need to recycle much faster. And composting keeps valuable organic materials out of landfills. It's my gold. Now, these are compost bins that are made from recycled materials. You can reuse anything, such as plastic garbage can with drilled holes. If you purchase or build a compost bin to keep the organic material in and wildlife out. The bin should be about 4 feet in diameter and 3 feet high. And finished compost is dark in color, smells earthy like soil. It's organic matter that's full of nutrients from recycled waste. So I love this. This landscape maintenance has enormous impact on our environment. It often requires the use of valuable resources. And maintenance practices can be really harsh. And here are maintenance practices that will meet sustainable goals. They include reducing fuel usage, which minimizes greenhouse gas emissions. Landscape maintenance is a great way to get physically active. Tools such as a push manual reel mower, some of you are going, yeah, right, hand trimmers and rakes can raise your heart rate while also reducing the environmental impacts of air pollutants. But you can do battery or electric. There's so many different options now. I recently got a battery operated chainsaw because I have property and I have large trees and I don't cut the trees down, but I have to clean it up sometimes. And, you know, chain oil also, you know, you can get barn chain oil that is harmful to our soils and ourselves because it's a carcinogenic made from petroleum. You get canola oil. It's a perfect substitute. But anyway, reduce fuel usage. We talked about that. Reduce the area of lawn that requires frequent mowing. Turf grass has little habitat or food value for wildlife and can require significant irrigation, fertilizer apps, and maintenance. And raise your mower height. Take a little off at a time. Longer grass blades will help keep out weeds and it shades the soil, reducing moisture loss. And mulch mowing, it provides about a quarter of the fertilizer needs. Now, in these photos are featured, they're called eco lawns, an ecology lawn. And they are my absolute favorite. I am in love with these. They're great for pollinators. They include species other than grasses, such as clovers, flowers, and other forbs. And clovers release nitrogen when mowed, so that ongoing fertilizer applications aren't necessary. The clover used to be an accepted, even encouraged part of lawns until the early 50s. It only acquired its weed status because of the earliest broadleaf 2,4-D herbicides. It killed it off along with the dandelions. Now, ecology lawns are more drought tolerant, disease resistant than conventional grass-only lawns. They stay green even during long, dry periods. You can mulch mow them at a 2-inch height or once a month at 4 to 5 inches to let the clover bloom in the summertime. So I have to give credit to ProTime Lawn Seed. They have Northwest native seed mixes. They carry some really cool alternative seeds to a traditional lawn. They even have no mow varieties. So I encourage to check them out on the website. It's fun to go through their site. A lot of us sometimes choose PVC fencing, because it seems like a really good choice. No painting, no maintenance. It seems to last long and it looks good, but we want to avoid the use of PVC. It cannot recycle. Polyvinyl chloride releases dioxin and a known carcinogenic during its manufacturing and disposal phases. PVC is commonly used in products such as plastic fencing, irrigation pipe, decking, and garden hoses. Again, it cannot be recycled and it has a relatively short lifespan. So homeowners should consider alternatives to PVC such as HDPE, high density polyethylene, for piping or wooden decking or fencing. To maximize the benefits to the environment, as well as the local economy, here's some tips to keep in mind when shopping for wood. The best way to guarantee that the lumber and other wood products you purchase have been harvested sustainably is to choose products certified by the Forest Stewardship Council or other independent nonprofit organizations which have determined that the materials meet a set of rigorous standards. So information on the FSC standards or the certification process and even how to find suppliers is available on their website at www.us.fsc.org. Now, reusing materials already on the property or those salvaged from a nearby location is more environmentally friendly than purchasing products made of virgin feedstock. And since lumber prices have gone up 250% since January of 2020, it just makes sense. And to eliminate off-gassing or leaching of toxins into the soil and our air and our water, don't purchase wood that's been treated with chemicals. Instead, choose a naturally rot-resistant species, such as cedar, that's grown in your area. And keep in mind that wood may require maintenance over its lifetime. So when paints or other finishes are necessary, choose the least toxic products available. You want to choose products that have no or low VOC content. Now, while VOCs were once necessary for good performance in many products, most companies now produce effective and cost-competitive alternatives. For example, less toxic paints, stains, and varnishes use water as a carrier instead of petroleum-based solvents to reduce emissions. And check the product labels and literature for information on VOC content. Usually it's listed in grams per liter. It can range from 5 to 200. So using a product with the lowest VOC content will yield the lowest overall environmental and health risk. So paints that meet the Green Seal standard are certified lower than 50 grams per liter for flat finish or 100 grams per liter for non-flat finish. So the life cycle of materials is really often a linear process that begins with extraction and ends with disposal. Materials move through the cycle once and then become a waste product. We want to change this. So the life cycle of materials is a circular process where materials and products are reused or recycled to avoid the extraction of virgin feedstock and minimize energy and resource inputs. So always consider the reuse of site structures and disposal of materials at the end of a project's life. Treated wood is toxic, so when it rots away, it leaches in the soil. So think about the structures you're building. The picture on the left, the wall was made from recycled driveway concrete, and the pathway on the right was made from reclaimed brick, eliminating the need to haul them off-site and dispose of them in a landfill, which would have greatly increased financial costs and environmental greenhouse gases. So as we learn that every imported material or product in a garden has environmental, economic, and human health impacts, let's look at strategies for reducing materials in the landscape. So design landscape features using standard material sizes to avoid waste and additional cuts and labor. Select manufacturers or suppliers that reuse or eliminate packaging material. Use durable materials that will last the life of the project and can be reused in future projects. And design landscape elements to be exposed. Avoid covering with additional materials for aesthetic purposes. So for example, covering a concrete wall with a brick or stone facade. Okay, so now you're going to know what kind of landscape I love. And this is it. I love this. It has soft edges. It's warm. It's welcoming. So a great garden provides design details that are unique to the site and helps tell the story of the place. So consider the many options. Reuse materials found on site or from local gardens and be creative. It doesn't need to look formal with shaped plants that require a lot of pruning. When a landscape has diversity, it adds interest, it draws the eye, and most importantly, it welcomes wildlife. Now, when reusing materials, it's often helpful to let the material inspire the design. So locate materials early in the process, determine what materials are available for reuse, and allow time to be creative and explore design ideas. And if you need to purchase, select materials that can be reused. Design site features to allow them to be disassembled with reasonable effort and without extensive damage to the material. For example, using screws instead of nails and avoiding the use of glues or other liquid adhesives. Now, landscapes can support the use of recycled materials two ways. First, by purchasing materials with recycled content. Now, typically, the higher the recycled content, the better. And second, by purchasing materials that can be easily recycled in the local area. So materials can contain either post-consumer or pre-consumer recycled content. Post-consumer items are preferred because they're made from materials that were once consumer items and have been diverted from the landfill. Now, pre-consumer recycled content typically comes from the manufacturing process and can often be easily recycled. And the steel hose that's on the left here is the most recycled material on the planet. And I just recently learned that there were steel hoses because I hardly go out and buy anything anymore. But steel, the vast majority of all steel is recycled back into new steel products with no loss of its physical properties. So as such, steel isn't just recycled, but it's multi-cycled. It can be recycled over and over and over again. Now, even though recycled materials lessen the need for virgin feedstock and avoid sending useful materials to the landfill, it uses significant energy and other resources that are often required during the recycling process. So because of this, recycled materials should be considered after options to reduce or reuse materials have been fully explored. So use minimally processed materials. The ecological and human health impacts of materials typically increase with each additional manufacturing phase. Therefore, materials that have reduced manufacturing and processing requirements often pose the fewest environmental and human health risks. So here's examples of minimally processed materials: uncut stone, earth materials, wood, and bamboo. And purchase local or indigenous materials. I know it seems like a no-brainer, but really it's become really easy for us to go either to a big box store or shop online, much easier. But using materials produced in the region has multiple advantages. Number one, it reduces the fossil fuels required for shipping, which is increasing our greenhouse gas emissions. It supports local businesses, your local community, and it feeds money into the regional economy. And one of the beauties of landscaping with local materials is they seem to belong and they enhance the region's unique sense of place. They can represent the identity of the area. This was a recycled fence made of pallets on the left here at Little Avalon Farm in Eastern Washington. And the picture on the right is decomposed granite trails at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. That decomposed granite is a byproduct of granite mining and comes from a local quarry there. So we're going to wind down a little bit here and just look at some simple projects of people that have reused materials like this whirligig yard art, an old window that's hung in a garden. This one's great. So this ponderosa pine is at a resident that drops a ton of pine needles, pine straw, that the homeowner recycles it and uses it as mulch. This resident reused materials as much as possible, and pictured here is a warped wooden plank that was salvaged and made into a planter. Simple projects. Broken pieces of recycled asphalt were used for a pathway. They saved it from a pile that was headed to the landfill, and I have to commend them for that. I wouldn't put asphalt near edible gardens, though. Reclaimed window bars were used here from a townhouse as fencing. And this was boards that were reused for gate and fencing, and it's super cool. They used fish weights for counterbalance on a gate to assist with automatically closing the gate. Metal deck railing reused for a grape arbor. And reusing rubber hose makes the best brace for staking new trees, very non-invasive on the trunk. Old garden hand tools used as plant markers that serve a dual purpose. People got very creative. Coffee sacks from a local roaster, they're free, and they line antique baskets. And most of the wood projects that you're looking at here are from reused fence boards, etc. Home compost was for flower and vegetable gardens, coffee sacks covering dahlias over the winter, tomato cages from reclaimed scraps of driveway mesh, ladders and cages that hold beans, and the ladders were salvaged from neighbors and family. The wire there again was used, and it was left from a neighbor's driveway project. Now, after it was established, this was a mostly drought-tolerant landscape, supplemented with gray water from an outdoor sink. Now, in conclusion, I have a short list of recycling centers, etc., on my final slide. But first, I have some final words. And yes, I had to Google cute insects. But we need to get off the insecticides, pesticides, and heavy synthetic fertilizers. We do not need them. It was reported back in 2019, the house sparrow, one of the world's most abundant birds, is in widespread decline. So what's going on? Food supply. In the past 31 years, we've lost more than 75% of our insects. They keep declining. We cannot lose 75% of our insects without major consequences. Of the world's 1 million known insect species, 400,000 are in decline. That's according to a recent report. And since 1970, 50% of all insects may have disappeared. Now, they play such an important role in our ecology that this loss is excruciatingly bad. It's so bad we may not be able to recover from such a loss, and that's going to play havoc up and down the food chain. So I'm speaking to all of you, consumers. Consumers hold the power. We hold the power. Our choices drive what is being manufactured. So please pay attention to what you're purchasing and using in your gardens. Do your homework on products, companies, and manufacturers before you purchase. And think of the natural resource you may be purchasing. It moves from an ecosystem that was its home, packaged up in plastic and shipped. So we want to reduce reuse, and recycle as much as possible to minimize our dependence on the Earth's natural resources and reimagine for a healthier planet. And our last slide here, I also think it's in a handout of some resources for recycling, reuse, and alternatives that are local. So that's the end. Are there any questions?
Wonderful presentation, Marianne. And yes, I think, Alyssa, we have a few questions, don't we?
We do. And yes, that handout is in the menu, the same menu where the questions box is. Just look under handouts and that should be available to you. And yeah, we've got some questions and comments here. I think I'll start with the question. What is the source for eco lawns?
ProTime Lawn Seed, and it is on the list here. ProTime Lawn Seed near the bottom of the list that I have on the handout.
Oh, great.
Yeah. It's a great
you.
site to just navigate through. Yes, welcome.
Perfect. Any good ideas for using wine bottles?
Oh, golly. That's a good question. You know, there's a tool, and I've never used it, but people they can cut the wine bottle, like the top off of it, and then they make tiny little hanging planters. But no, I think that's something you're going to have to research. I've never used wine bottles, so that's a new one, at least not in the landscape.
Yeah, I did visit a community garden once, and they used it to line the path, kind of stuck them upside down in the ground.
I mean,
so I've actually seen that.
You could recycle the glass and put it in pathways. Yep. You'd probably want to tumble it to make sure it doesn't have hard edges. That's an idea. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Yeah. What guidance do you have on the use of recycled tires? I haven't used them because of the rubber compounds, but there are many available in our area. Is there any way to use them safely?
I can't answer that. I do not know the answer to that. Tires are toxic as far as I know, and I don't know how to get rid of that. You know, I know that road runoff from tires is affecting our streams. I can't remember the chemical. If somebody remembers what that is, that it's made of, but I don't know. Gosh, these are really good questions.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what to do about that one. This is why we need to get off of, start making some changes. I know that they're realizing that the tires that are produced now, the runoff from these tires from roads is affecting the salmon in our streams. Right. So hopefully they're going to start looking into a different way of manufacturing these tires.
Right. Yeah, that's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Here's a comment, and I think there's a question in here too. My understanding is that bark as a mulch is much more hydrophobic than wood chips. I'm not sure if this is associated to bagged commercial bark.
I think it is associated to bagged commercial bark.
Okay.
So I would avoid that. And really, arborist chips are your best bet. On this list, there is chip drop, which is what I use in my local area. And you can, it says Arborist Wood Chips, it says getchipdrop.com, and they do free deliveries of local arborists get on this, and we'll do free deliveries of arborist chips. You just, like I said, tip your driver. And if they don't have it in your area, you can, if you sign up for it, it encourages local arborists to get on that, or even just check with your local arborist and see if they'll deliver or drop off. They're always looking for places to drop off wood chips. So did that answer your question, I hope?
I think so. That was great. Great to have more information on those wood chips.
Yeah, and just a reminder to
folks. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's okay. Just a reminder to folks. So most of our native plants, wood chips are really great for if you have like a riparian area that you're incorporating with higher water use. But just folks, just remember, if you're doing these really low to no water use plants that are native, they really don't want to have the wood chips next to them. They really prefer rock mulch. Just because the wood chips hold in too much moisture and then we wind up with mold and mildew issues. So just keep that in mind. You can definitely incorporate wood chips into your landscape, just not right around your native or low water use plants.
And is that also true with bark?
Anything wood, it's just going to hold in way too much moisture. You can use it on pathways if you have good edging to keep it on the pathways. We actually switch it. We use rock mulch around the plants for our native plants, and you can use wood mulch in other areas of your landscape just as a ground cover. So a little difference in thinking here in the super dry.
Well, also the native plants, even here, it's best to keep the wood mulch or any bark away from the plants. So, yeah.
Great point. Along the lines of rock, what is the best way to acquire decorative large rocks for my garden?
Now that you'll need to check locally. And, Heritage Gardens, do you have anything that they can, any resource?
We do. So on our website, under our resources page, we do have a vendor list for where you can source, local companies that have rock mulch and granite and basalt features. And what we tried to do is when we sort of research these companies and is ask them, where are you getting your material from? Because again, we don't want to bring in material that they're shipping, from the desert Southwest and bringing up, all these specialized rocks. We really want native basalt that has been sourced, regionally. So we do have a vendor list on our website, hgcd.info, and that's a good place to get started.
Great. What company has ground up granite for pathways?
Again, you want to check locally. Do you have a local quarry there?
Typically we don't really have granite here that I have seen. If you want to go with something that is really indigenous to our area, use crushed basalt. It actually compacts very nicely, just like the granite does. But the basalt is, remember from the basalt flows that we had here, we have got lots and lots of basalt in Eastern Washington. That's really our go-to. And take a look, the Master Gardener's demonstration garden at the Kennewick Library. The pathway through the native plant garden is crushed basalt. So that's a good example that you can go take a look at.
Great. I am learning all kinds of things this morning. Here's a comment again about kind of local conditions. Fabulous that you mentioned soil testing. Eastern Washington soil frequently is naturally high in phosphorus levels, so soil tests are critical to show gardeners that 10-10-10 fertilizers or even high levels of compost may not be beneficial.
Right, that is true. You really should have a soil test in your soils and be careful what you can over apply anything.
Yeah, and even in our area, we have high nitrates, in several of the counties here in Eastern Washington. So if you're looking at your lawn, people often don't realize that their nitrogen levels are just fine.
Right.
When you're applying irrigation water, you might be applying quite a bit of nitrogen as well.
Yeah.
So test. That's a great comment.
Yes. And then the final thing I've got here is just some more brainstorming on those wine bottles. Make a bottle tree out of your wine bottles.
Oh, there you go.
Great idea.
It is a great idea. It's art. It draws the eye. Get creative.
That's wonderful. Yeah, what an amazing presentation. Marianne, thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's
Thank
just
you.
great.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for looking up all of those local resources. That was above and beyond and very much appreciated.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
Absolutely, our pleasure. All right, if anyone, or just a reminder, if anyone else has any questions, you can type those into the questions box. But I think next on our list is a quick break, right, Alyssa?
That is correct. Yeah, let me pull up the agenda here again, and I think we have a 15-minute break.
All right.
And
So
go
we are
stretch
going to
our legs, get some more coffee, go step outside for a little bit.
go check on the weather. It's gorgeous.
Oh. Yes.
Yes, very
Exactly.
good. Well, we are right on schedule. So we will take a quick 15-minute break, and we will see you all back here at 11 o'clock with Dr. Stephen Love, who is going to regale us on the wonderful world of buckwheats. I am so excited. So go stretch your legs, and we will be back with you shortly. As a reminder, if you are in Benton, Franklin, or Yakima counties and you would like some assistance with the development of a heritage garden on your property, you can reach out to Ann Autry, who covers Yakima County, or myself, and we're happy to schedule a site visit, a free site visit, to get that process started. And as Ann said, if you already have a garden you think might qualify as a certified heritage garden, let us know. May is when we start going around and certifying those, which is always a very exciting time for us. All right, Alyssa, are we ready to get back at it?
I'm ready.
All right, Ann, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
Yes, I would. Dr. Stephen Love is a University of Idaho Extension consumer horticultural specialist. Dr. Love has collected, grown, and or evaluated over 1,200 species of intermountain native wildflowers and shrubs, and released over 100 native plant products into the landscape nursery industry. His presentation will focus on incorporating wild buckwheats, genus Eriogonum. Oh man, come on, Heather.
Well, I probably don't say it correctly either, but I always say Eriogonum.
Thank you. It just I couldn't get my mouth around that.
Or Eriogonum or something like that. He'll tell us how to say it.
Okay. Into low water use landscape. Thank you for that save.
So, Dr. Love, can you hear us?
I can hear you. I'm trying to get my. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me plug my microphone back in because I'll have better sound.
Excellent. And then you can tell us how to say the correct name.
The line, it got disconnected.
No worries. And then you can tell us how to say the proper way to say the scientific name for buckwheat, since we're struggling here this morning.
I'll make reference to that. Okay, is my presentation up?
Yes.
Okay, good. So in the program, it was kind of simplified as to what my presentation would be, just landscaping with native plants. And I actually do a lot of kind of general presentations on landscaping with native plants, but I decided in this particular case to concentrate on one small group, one genus of the wild buckwheats to deliver my presentation. I really love buckwheats. They're amazing plants. They have some issues that make them a little harder to deal with as far as creating commercial availability for these particular plants. Among other things, they really truly are shrubs, and yet they're treated a lot like just perennials, but they grow slow and they're a little bit harder to establish than your typical wildflowers. And so consequently, some people aren't patient enough to get them into the landscape. And so popularity probably isn't near as high with these particular plants as what it could be. But anyway, as mentioned, I work on native plants in a project at the University of Idaho. I live in a little town called Aberdeen, which is in southeastern Idaho, not Aberdeen, Washington, near the town of Pocatello. And we have a research and extension center here. And on that center, I do a lot of what's called plant domestication work. In other words, I take plants from the wild and do just enough selection and work on them that we can handle them in the nursery industry. Basically, I'm trying to take the native plant concept a step beyond those people who are really, really interested in this type of thing and will go to extra work to do that. I'm trying to move it beyond that to people who maybe aren't quite as interested, aren't quite as educated, but would really like to do something if it was available to them. And I'm trying to make it available to just more of the run-of-the-mill gardening folks, and kind of expand the native plant concept. Native plants are so very important in our climate. They're so important with respect to water conservation, because most of our plants, unless you plant a lot of riparian plants, from the Western Cascades to the edge of the Rocky Mountains, we live in a dry climate, and the plants that live there tend to be drought tolerant, and so we can use them to conserve water. And then the other thing is our habitat development, our urban pollinator support, and other things that are critical to try to create environments where we can actually share our space with some of the other important and critical and interesting animals. And so we need to develop that mindset, and I think it's coming. And I'm trying to be a part of that process. And I'll talk just a little bit about what that domestication process looks like as I go along here. So native plant domestication then is the process of enhancing the utility of native plants while trying to maintain the native characteristics. In other words, we're trying to select for the most attractive, trying to create some uniformity, trying to create something that will be manageable in the supply chain, basically the nursery industry, as well as something that will do what people want it to do. And when it gets into somebody's hands, that it has some reasonable chance of being successfully established and being what the person envisions when they first purchase that. All of those things become very, very important if we're going to attract a larger audience of people that want to do this type of thing. And then also you have the process of educating people so that they're willing to try and accept things that maybe they wouldn't at an earlier time. But one of the characteristics that we really want to maintain in these native plants through this domestication process are habitat support. Are they still just as good for pollinators? Are they still attractive to birds for food purposes and for what other uses they put them to? And are they still good for the resource conservation that we would like to obtain with a native plant garden? And if we can maintain those things and at the same time create a little more attractive product, then people are more willing to use them. And so that's the process that we're trying to accomplish. Some of the essential characteristics I've already talked about a little bit, but uniformity, predictability, and aesthetic value are important if we're going to attract people who want a really nice, attractive yard, and yet still want to be a part of the movement of going towards more sustainable practices. So let me just quickly describe how we go through this process. You know, if you go out into the wild and you collect a bunch of plants, and that's what we do. In fact, we're setting up a collection trip right now for a small group of us, and hopefully COVID won't put a kibosh on that, but we're going to go out and collect some plants. And when you go out and collect in a native population, first of all, from population to population, the plants can be very different. But even within a population, you have sometimes extreme variability. And this particular graphic kind of shows that. You have a particular species you're going to collect from, and you have all kinds of variability in plant size and in plant color and in leaf size and in other traits that are more hidden, like disease resistance and other things. But if you just take that seed and plant it in a yard, that variability is expressed. Now, if you're an altruist for native plants, maybe that's what you want. But for the average consumer, that's not what they want. They want to know what they're getting, and they want it to perform in the way that their expectations will, at the level of their expectations. So in this domestication and selection process, then we'll plant out a bunch of plants of a single species, and then we'll choose, like this plant that's circled here, we'll choose maybe the form that we would really like to have available for people to grow. And then we rogue the rest of the plants that don't approach that level of appearance, or maybe other particular traits, adaptation to soils, whatever, but that are performing at a level that we would like them to do so. And then we just plant we only collect the seed then from that particular plant, and then we plant that seed back in our research plots. And then we let them grow out again, and then again we kind of take out all of the plants that really aren't the ones that we want for whatever reason, and just leave the ones that are pretty close. They aren't going to ever be exact. We aren't going to take out all the variability, but we'll take out a lot of it. And then at the end of the third cycle, or maybe the fourth cycle, then going through that process, then what we have are mostly plants that give us the appearance and the performance that we want. And one of the things that we really need in our native plants, and this is, and let me just express my personal opinion, and you may have a very different opinion, and that's okay. But if you're going to plant plants in an urban setting, in your yard, around your business, or wherever, that place will never be, ever be a restored habitat. It will never be back to what it was before people moved there. And that even goes back to thousands of years of influence of Native Americans. Once people are involved, it's never going to be exactly the same. And so the decisions we make and what we do in those settings can be and should be probably different than the procedures that we use to restore a habitat in the wild. And the variability that's so important, the genetic variability that is so important for adaptation and those kinds of things in the wild, so that we can maintain the integrity and persistence of those plants in our wildlands, really have no bearing on success in an urban setting. And so we can do and should do some different things with these native plants. But mostly what we want to do is make these plants and make this process attractive to a larger percent of our population, to get more people to buy into it, and creating plants that perform well and do what people need them to do, and perform well for the nursery industry so they can produce enough of them to make a living at it, which is one of the real serious problems we have with native plants right now, is just where do you get them? And where do you get more than just a handful of plants that you can buy anywhere anyway? it's got to be an economically viable system. And so that's part of our selection process too, is creating plants that you can easily or more easily grow from seed and manage in a way that would make them attractive for a producer. Okay, so with that said, that's introduced a little bit of my, giving you a little bit of introduction to what I'm doing and how I approach things. But let me talk about buckwheats. This particular picture I took on a hike at an elevation of about 11,000 feet in the Pioneer Mountains in central Idaho. And this is mostly, the most of the plant material in this particular picture is mat buckwheat. And you say, and that is Eriogonum is how you say the genus name, Eriogonum cespitosa. Cespitose means flat or low. And so this is the low buckwheat or the mat buckwheat that often grows in high elevations in our Idaho mountains. And it also happens to be an amazingly attractive landscape plant. But in this particular place where I took this picture, and then there's a little bit of probably Phlox aculeata mixed in with it. But a whole ridge top was just covered with this and everything was in bloom. And it was just amazing. And this is why, you can look at this picture, this is why I love buckwheats. And this is why I think buckwheats can take a much greater place in our landscapes. Not only because of this mat buckwheat, but buckwheats are so variable. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's around 250 species. Probably half of those are very worthy landscape plants. And you can do all kinds of things with them, different things because of the variability that exists within the genus. So wild buckwheats are a genus of about 250 species. 146 of those species are perennial. So a little more than 100 of them are actually annuals. And some of them are actually kind of weedy annuals. They kind of take over waste places. And which, you can call them weeds or not weeds if you want, but they kind of have weedy habits. But the perennials are the ones we want to talk about for landscaping because they're going to have persistence in the landscape. And they're going to have the other traits that we want within our landscapes. And there was he was the professor of Eriogonum, Jim Reveal. He passed away suddenly, fairly young actually, about 2 or 3 years ago. But he was the botanist and taxonomist that basically defined the genus Eriogonum and named the species and did much of the work that provides us with the understanding we have of these species. And he wrote an article, and you can actually find this if you're interested, just Google James Reveal Eriogonum, and it will bring up, among other things, an article that he wrote on the wild buckwheats as a rock garden plant, or something to that effect. And it's many pages long, but has wonderful descriptions of all of the plants and the ones that he thinks are worthy of landscape use. And in that list are about 128 descriptions of about 128 species. Very interesting reading, even if you're never going to plant some. But anyway, so we have a pretty good pool of plants that we can draw from, according to Jim. And I found his writings to be very true on the ground when we're working on these plants. It presents quite a palette of plants that we can use to enhance our landscapes. Now, since 2005, we started this plant domestication project in 2005. I was actually a potato breeder in my old life, but I had a chance to move to what we call urban horticulture and to do some specialized work with native plants and drought tolerant landscapes. And I made that move in 2005, so about 16 years ago. And it's been a wonderful shift for me professionally, but what amazing kinds of things that we've been able to do, and the amazing things that I've seen in doing that work. And I'm always still learning, which is one of the reasons that I made the move. I felt like I'd kind of done what I could do in my previous projects. And so anyway, since that time, since 2005, we have collected, and this is a year old, so actually given what we've collected this last year, it's more, but we've collected a total number of accessions of buckwheats, wild buckwheats, that comes to 768 different populations. And that's, you know, in some cases we've collected many of the same species, but the variability that exists in some of these species means that each accession is still very different one from another, even if it's within a species. Sometimes they're taxonomically different. They might be a different subspecies, a different variety, or whatever. Sometimes they're just very, very different forms of the same taxon. Within that, the total number of species we have collected is 53, and the accessions that we have gone through the domestication process on and now are in increases, where we're just maintaining them and increasing seed of them in preparation for possibly making them available for commercial increase. We have 46 of those accessions, and that represents 30 some species. I didn't count the number of species. And the accessions that have been transferred to a company that we developed a partnership with that is in Twin Falls, Idaho, a little company called Native Roots. And they have first right of refusal to everything we develop through this domestication process. And the accessions we have transferred are 22. So there are 22 different types of buckwheats within that company that they are sharing with other companies as well. There's a company called, oh, you might have to help me. It's in, is it Connor, Washington? Not very far from, what's that?
Plants of the Wild?
Plants of the Wild, thank you. I've been there a couple of times and visited them, but anyway, they're one of the companies that's growing a lot of the plants that come out of this Native Roots company. And so they're starting to accumulate a number of these buckwheat species and have them available. Okay, so that's what we've done so far. Now let me talk a little bit about just why buckwheats are good to landscape with. Then let me talk to you about some of the species we've tested and evaluated and gone through the process of domesticating that you might want to consider for inclusion in your landscapes or in your landscape plans. The things that buckwheats bring is one, they are very drought tolerant. I live in a place that's probably even drier than where most of you live, although there are places in central Washington that are pretty dry. But we get about 8 inches of precipitation here in the Snake River Valley in this little town of Aberdeen. And most of our precipitation, like similar to yours, is as the form of winter snow or early spring rain. And we're about through our precipitation season now. We'll get a few thunder showers, maybe another rainstorm or two between now and next November, but there won't be much. And I've got, I think, about 30 species of buckwheats in my personal rock garden. I have an acre of land, and it's a beautiful little piece of land, about 1/8 of an acre, that I've just dedicated to native plants. And one entire bed, about 40-50 feet long and 25 feet wide, is all buckwheats. And then I got buckwheat scattered around in other places too. But anyway, almost 5 years ago, I had a really serious heart attack, massive heart attack, put me in the hospital for about 4 months. Had to be close to the hospital for 6 months. Didn't get back to work for 7 to 8 months. Was in pretty tough shape for the next 2 years. And I've mostly recovered, largely because I now actually have an artificial heart. And I'm working in my gardens now and doing the things I want to do. But there was a period of 2 years there where I couldn't do much. And these native plants in general, and buckwheats particularly, got pretty much ignored during that 2-year period, including the first year I really, after the heart attack, I couldn't even get out to irrigate things properly. I turned some of the irrigation of some of my yard over to my kids, and they helped me manage it a little, my grown kids. But the rock garden, the native plant garden, didn't get much. In fact, it got watered one time during that first year, and I think 2 or 3 times the next year. And I thought, oh man, this garden, that's probably just not enough. It's going to go to pot. Things are going to die. Everything's going to be bad. I'm going to have to start over. Well, at the end of that first year, and then going into the next year, the plants started growing again, and they started growing pretty good. And I'm going, hey, maybe some of them are going to live. And it turns out I didn't lose anything. And they came back and were just as beautiful after that year of just not getting anything that they need, and look just as good as they did the year before. And so they are very drought tolerant and very hardy and survivable. But also buckwheats, even in comparison to a lot of other native perennials, are long-lived. Some of them have very long bloom periods. Some bloom multiple times in the year, others only once. Many are evergreen, which is very unique in this interior Intermountain West climate that we live in. Most plants are not evergreen, and the foliage can be very attractive. Not only can it be attractive coming out of winter when lots of things are really ugly, but they can be attractive for the summer after you take the old blooms off when they're done blooming. Some of them turn colors going into fall, so you have that element of it as well. They require minimal maintenance. Basically, once you get them established, all you have to do is go in and kind of clip off the old blooms, and you don't even have to do that, but they look better if you do that. And that's about it. Other than that, they kind of pretty much take care of themselves. Don't need. I put a little fertilizer on my rock garden when I planted my plants, and that's been 14 years ago, and I've never put any on since, and it looks marvelous. And then of course minimal water, minimal. And anything that you have to do, no pest or disease control, anything that you have to do with other places in your yard, you probably don't have to do with the buckwheats. And then the other thing that's very important now and becoming more important as people are finding more and more interest in this, which is marvelous in my thoughts, but they are a very unique pollinator support plant. You can look at these plants, these buckwheat plants that I've got along the right side of this particular picture, and you look at the flowers, and each one of those heads includes probably 200 to 300 flowers, except for the bottom one, doesn't have quite as many flowers in the heads, but that's the rock buckwheat. But anyway, you can tell then, and the heads are probably almost universally among those that you see here, less than an inch across. And so you can see how small the flowers are. So they tend to attract a whole series of very, very small pollinators. And not only do they attract a series of small pollinators, but they attract many, many specialist pollinators that rely on and work best on Eriogonums, on the buckwheats. And here's just a few of examples of things that visit the buckwheats: the spheccid wasps, the papillid wasps, the bombillid flies. These are ones that, if you don't have buckwheats, they're probably not going to be in your yard. They rely on them. And they visit them specifically. But not only these plants, but many of the generalist pollinators visit them as well. The bumblebees not so much, because they're just too big, I think, to even feed on the flowers. But even European honeybees and lots of the ground nesting bees and smaller ground nesting bees and other insects. I was telling our hosts there the other day when we were doing our little practice session that I've gone out, especially in late summer when some of the buckwheats are still blooming, but there's not much else blooming, and walked up to a buckwheat plant and disturbed the pollinators that are there, and it's almost like the whole plant gets up and leaves. There's just, on one plant, there might be thousands of very diverse group of pollinators feeding on that plant. So they're an amazing pollinator plant, and not only amazing for things that we understand as being pollinators, but all kinds of things you've probably never seen before. And if you plant them, I live in the middle of potato fields, and it's a long, long way to the nearest wild buckwheat plant from where I live. But these pollinators have found me in my plots at work and in my own garden. They're there. I don't know where they have come from, and I don't know where how far they had to fly to get there here in the first place, but they're here. So this is my rock garden. You can see lots of penstemons in the background and some other unusual and different plants, but the bed that kind of runs up from the bottom middle up towards the top right here is all buckwheats, all different kinds of buckwheats, some in flower, some that won't flower here for another several weeks or even a month, and different colors, a lot of yellows, a lot of whites, a lot of buff, but also some pinks and some other colors as well. And if I could disturb those plants and ruffle them a little so you could see the pollinators are going crazy there. Now this is another place in my yard. This is right in front of my house. Most of the rest of my yard, other than my rock garden and a little pasture area that I converted into a native meadow, most of the rest of my yard is more traditional in landscaping. But one thing that I'm finding is my native plants are invading my property, and it's not, they're not invading because they're invasive and they're moving themselves. I'm moving them. I just go, oh, this is a better plant that I've got over in that part of my yard. I think I'll just move this one over there, and I'll have another native plant. And so that's what's happening. 2 years ago, this particular part of my landscape, and you know, you can't see much in it because I had planted it up to the when I took this picture, but the plants are very small, and you see in the bottom left-hand corner how small that plant is. But I converted this bed from junipers and cotoneasters into buckwheats. However, I did leave one rose plant right in the middle of it, and that's the rose plant you see. And then I've got a few grasses that are here and there too, and a few other odds and end plants, some other native plants like heucheras and some other things that, some evening primroses. Anyway, I converted this basically to almost entirely native plants. And then I put chips down, and I find that if you don't water very often, there was a conversation earlier about what you should use and not to use chips around native plants. But I'm finding that if you do not water very often, and with this particular garden, I probably only water it about once every 3 weeks, the chips don't hurt the plants. And I haven't lost any plants to this point. I haven't lost a single plant, a single buckwheat plant. And there's probably 200 buckwheat plants all around this garden and through this garden. And anyway, I've converted what used to be traditional landscape into native plant garden. And I, even though the plants are still small, I already love it. It's marvelous. And you see the red color on that buckwheat on the bottom. I took this plant this picture in late fall. That's the color that plant takes on when the weather gets cold. And this is a mat forming. It's a mat forming subspecies or variety, I guess, of the sulfur flower buckwheat, and it'll grow. It's probably going to grow in flower to a height of about 8 inches, and they'll get 3, sometimes maybe even 4 feet across. And so this will all be covered with these buckwheats here in a year or two. But it does take a little time, and that's one of the problems, again, that people have with buckwheat sometimes is they don't act like perennials. You can't plant them and they're going to bloom this year and be glorious. You got to wait. But you know, I think with education we can resolve that issue. We wait for most of the other shrubs we plant, and they are truly shrubs. And so I think we just need some education on that. But anyway, buckwheats are taking over my yard. Okay, now I want to go through a little period where I'm going to talk about some specific buckwheat species, some that I think you might be interested in if you're going to landscape with these plants. And the first I'm going to show is a group of landscape-worthy buckwheats that are regionally native and are found within close proximity to Yakima in some form. Some of these plants grow a lot of other places too, but they will grow very, very close to where you are. Sometimes not right down in the valley floor, might be on the ridges or hills up around you, but they'll not be too far. They'll be at least within the county. And then I'm going to discuss a few that are not native to Washington at all, but that if that doesn't concern you, you know, and this, I'm going to get up on my soapbox just a little bit. One of the things I'm finding that is being actually destructive right now to the native plant movement is we're getting a lot of policy issue, a lot of policy making that is happening associated with native plants and native plant plantings. And a lot of those include statements of provenance. It has to be a local native. It has to occur within a certain number of miles of where you live in order for it to be considered native. It has to anyway, well, that's one of the things that's happening. And if you plant a plant that comes from a different place, even if it's a species that you have locally, you can't still consider it native. And one of the problems with that is it makes it almost impossible for the native plant industry, the native plant nursery industry, to service our need for native plants. Because what you do is you create such a small marketplace for those particular native plants, for something that can be called native, where native has been regulated as a term. You've created such a small marketplace, nobody can make a living at doing it, and so consequently nobody does it, and the plants aren't available. And I believe that we need to take a step back from that. I think when more people begin to grow native plants, maybe we can move into that kind of thinking a little bit more in the future. But right now, I think we need the freedom for the industry needs the freedom to make this work at a level that people can become involved in it. And so anyway, off my soapbox, but that's my personal feeling. I think we should stay out of the regulation, at least initially, and let this develop as the industry can make it develop. Just another thought. And you may have a totally different opinion on that. That's okay. You can get on your soapbox when you're given the next presentation. Okay, so what I'm going to do with these is I'm going to throw up a slide from each of these that shows a map that comes out of the USDA's plants database, and just show where that plant is native to, and talk a little bit about where it comes from, and then I'll go to the next slide, and where it shows basically some pictures and a little description of the plant. And I'm not going to really go through each of those slides line by line, because there's quite a bit of information and it would get very boring. I'm just going to tell you some specific things about that plant that I think may be of interest to you. And with your other half of your brain, you can read what's on the slide. So anyway, I'm going to talk first about strict buckwheat. And this is a a very landscape-worthy plant that has a fairly significant native range that goes all the way down to Northern California up through central Washington and east into Montana. I've collected it in a number of places. It has very different forms in different places and has some subspecies and some varieties. A lot of the ones that you find of this species that are farther south, down into Nevada, California, tend to be yellow flowered. A lot of the ones that are farther north tend to be white flowered. And I actually find the white flowered ones, and many of them phase into pinks. I find them to be more attractive and more landscape worthy than the ones that you find further south. So this is what it looks like. This is in my my yard, in my garden. You can see it's mostly white, but it does have a pink cast to it. The foliage is evergreen, but it gets a little ragged towards the end of the summer, but will come through the winter and come out of the spring in reasonably intact shape. The foliage is only about, maybe 6 to 8 inches tall. And then the rest of the plant, which you see, which is approaching 2 feet tall in this particular case, comes as the growth of the inflorescence occurs. This one tends to spread a little bit from seed if you plant it in one place in your yard and don't remove any seedlings. I don't find it to be aggressively spreading. I mean, it's not going to show up all over the yard, but you will have plants that will come up within a few feet of, 5 to 6 feet of the plant. And if you don't want to remove them, it will continue to spread out and out, and you'll have more and more of the plants, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but recognize that it will happen. And this is the form of strict buckwheat that I've collected, put through domestication to kind of create a uniform pink color in it. And then we've shared this with our Native Roots partners, and they're marketing that particular form of it. Eriogonum compositum. I love this plant. My technician at work, who is now an avid native plant connoisseur and has basically converted his whole yard to natives, and didn't even know what a native plant was when he came to work for me about 8 years ago. But anyway, he loves this one, and he's given it some nicknames. I was going to tell you my favorite one, but I can't remember it anymore. My brain's somewhere else. But anyway, the native extent range for this particular species is just little pieces and parts of western Idaho, all the way down through central and eastern Washington, Oregon, and into northern California. He calls it the Dr. Seuss plant, is what he calls it. And I'll show you why. Calls it the Dr. Seuss plant because when it's just coming into bloom, this is what it looks like. And it looks like all those little round-headed plants that Dr. Seuss put in his books. But it's a little bigger plant. It'll grow up to 30 inches easily, and sometimes even taller than that. The flowers are usually dark yellow, although I have seen some phases of it that are more cream colored to buff. It has some different forms, some more fuzzy than others, some with smaller leaves than others. But all of them are very nice plants and very landscape worthy. It does have a problem with the foliage not being truly evergreen. And so it really takes a beating in the winter, and it's kind of unattractive to come as it comes out in the spring, and kind of like everything else that grows in your yard. But it just remove some of the dead tissue around the crown early in the spring, and it'll come back up through it and look really nice. And this is one of the larger forms of it. This plant that I took this picture of, it was easily 3 feet tall. We collected this from Hell's Canyon area on the Oregon-Idaho border, and the flower heads on this particular form of it, if you count all of those inflorescences, all of those that come up from one stem, which is basically everything you see in this picture, they're 8, sometimes 10 inches across. And what a wonderful plant. And it's a plant that when it's in bloom in the garden, it sucks people in. Douglas buckwheat. Now this one, you see in this map, the Idaho map is, the Idaho part of the map is in green. That means somebody thinks it might be there, but we really don't have any documented cases. So this is mostly a Northern California, Oregon, and Washington plant. And it's a very small little plant with very silver foliage and little pom-pom flowers. Wonderful plant, very long-lived, very hardy, very tough, evergreen to the point that when it comes out of winter, it looks the same as it did going into the fall. I love this. It's one of the mat forming types of buckwheats, and I love this one as a landscape plant. It needs a place where it won't have much competition with other things, where everything growing around it is fairly diminutive and small and might need a little space. It doesn't like to be shaded. And so it needs a kind of a special place to grow. But if you've got that place, what an incredible plant. It's a slow initial grower. It never blooms the first year out. It only blooms sparsely the second year, but then it starts to take its place in the garden after that, and will really perform for who knows how long. It will probably outlive us. Eriogonum heracleoides, the parsnip flower buckwheat, and this is a buckwheat that grows in a lot of places in the West, and including around Washington. Has many different forms. Many of these have not really been named as subtaxon. They could be easily, but they haven't been. It's just nobody's ever taken the time to do it. So there's a lot of different types of it growing in different places. In fact, almost everywhere you go, it's a little bit different. But it has some characteristics that are unique to it and that makes it easily recognizable. One of them is, if you look at one of these stems on this particular picture, you'll see about halfway down there's a whorl of leaves. And there's only 2 buckwheat species that have that. And this is one of them. So if you go out and see a buckwheat in the wild and it has a whorl of leaves halfway down the flowering stalk, it's probably parsnip flower buckwheat. It's a little prone to winter injury. Every form of it that I've grown is prone to that to some degree. In a little milder climate or under a heavy snow load, it would probably remain evergreen. But when it's in a place like I live, where if I have 4 inches of snow on the ground in the middle of the winter, that's a lot. But anyway, it kind of takes a beating, but it doesn't take it long to grow out of it and to come back from it. And we've selected a couple forms of it that do have more tolerance to winter cold and winter sunlight. It's actually to some degree desiccation from winter sunlight that actually does the damage to the leaves on this plant. But this is one form of it we've selected also. We found this near a place called Mesa Falls in just straight north of me in eastern Idaho, up in the highlands of Island Park. And it has much bigger clusters of flowers, much bigger leaves. Very beautiful plant. But again, takes a little bit of winter injury, but if you can put up with that, it's pretty nice. Eriogonum ovalifolium. This is a mounding plant. I'm gonna have to hurry a little faster. I'm taking too much time, but that's okay. You're all interested, right? But this grows all over and has many different subtaxon, some yellow flowered, some red flowered, some pink flowered, some white flowered, and some really low growing and flat, some not so much. Anyway, you see one form of it to the right here, one that we collected in the high elevations of central Idaho. But I consider this to be an absolutely outstanding landscape plant. You can do a lot of things with it, and it's an amazing plant. And one of the nice things with it, it does only bloom for about 6 weeks in the late spring and early summer. But once it's done blooming, you can just run your hand over it, and all the flower stems come off, and all this beautiful bluish silver foliage comes out, and it's just extremely attractive for the rest of the year. And the foliage stays intact through the winter. The seed can be a little hard to collect just because of the way it grows. The seed kind of gets embedded down into the foliage, and that's more of an issue with somebody who wants to grow it and sell it, but it's an issue that may restrict it from being as widely accepted. This is Navali, the variety Navali of this ovalifolium, and I have this growing in my rock garden, and that's the one that grows on the western slopes of the Cascades in the higher elevations, and is probably very close to you. Kind of pinkish, very beautiful plant, pinkish flowers. And then here's some other forms. You see the yellow one. You see the Depressum, which is very common, much like Navali, but the one that grows in Idaho in our high elevations. Purpureum, bottom left, a more stiffly upright plant as far as the flowers are concerned. And Williamsii, which is a very interesting, has very attractive foliage, not as showy of flowers, but very, very interesting foliage. And it only grows in a little small limited area around Reno, Nevada. The rock buckwheat, this one is very shrubby in form, although small. Grows in a lot of the same places that some of the other plants that we've talked about grow, but it can have kind of buff colored flowers. I like the yellow flowered form better, and it's a very clear, very nice yellow. And you have actually both the buff forms and the yellow forms growing close to you there in Yakima County. Anyway, it can be difficult to grow from seed. Sometimes the seed, you collect the seed and plant it and it just doesn't grow. And I'm not sure why. It has some kind of requirements that we're not meeting very well in our propagation efforts, but we need to do a little more work on that. But you can get a few plants to grow usually. And so anyway, and then there's Eriogonum umblatum, sulfur flower buckwheat. And if you've got buckwheats growing in your yard, it's probably this species. Wonderful species, has 24 named varieties. That's how variable it is. And within the varieties, you still have amazing diversity. So you have a lot of options of what you can grow as far as Eriogonum umblatum. And again, they grow everywhere, all over the West. Everywhere it's not raining every day. But anyway, the sulfur flower buckwheat can have cream flowers or yellow flowers. It has very confusing taxonomy, so sometimes you don't really even know what you're getting, and sometimes what you're getting isn't what somebody says you're getting isn't really what you're getting. But regardless, it's a great landscape plant. And here's a number of the varieties. Here's a number of the varieties that I grow and have had success with, but I've had a success with probably 15 of the named varieties. Dicrocephalum, kind of a light yellow to cream colored plant, lower growing. Porteri is the one I planted in my front yard, very flat growing, and the flowers don't get much off the foliage. Minus, which has very interesting lime green leaves and very, very red flowers. Nevadense is a very extremely variable, even though it's a variety, it's variable. You see it growing in a lot of different places. So there's a lot of forms of it. Ellipticum is one that is very nice in the fact that it blooms late summer, which is kind of an off season for a lot of native plants, and provides some great pollinator service because of that. Okay, Eriogonum niveum is the white or snow buckwheat. Grows all over central and eastern Washington, and it grows in very dry, difficult places. And this is what it looks like. It actually looks a lot like the first one I mentioned, strictum, but if you look at the conformation of the inflorescences, they're actually quite different. It is evergreen. The foliage, though, will tend to degrade a little over after bloom, and so it won't be quite as attractive as for some of these others, but it also blooms very late. It's often still blooming when I go into my first fall frost. And so even though the foliage doesn't stay good late, it doesn't really matter as well because you've still got bloom, but good landscape potential. Also, like strictum, it can be a little weedy from seed, so it'll show up growing here and there and other places. Okay, quickly, I want to just share with you a few buckwheats that come from the greater Intermountain West, but don't grow necessarily in Washington, or at least not in the part of Washington where you live. Eriogonum arcuatum. I really love this plant. It's a plant that it's the settee plant. You can sit on it. Let me show you why. This particular plant that I'm showing right here is 3 feet in diameter, probably getting close to 10 feet tall. And it's the foliage that's that tall because the flowers are actually embedded in the foliage. But it's a wonderful plant, completely, I've got deciduous on here, but I think I made that mistake because I copied this slide from another one. It's actually fully evergreen. And it is a wonderful plant in a landscape and easy to grow. It's difficult to harvest the seeds again because they're so embedded in the foliage. You can't just cut them off easily and take the dried inflorescences away. You kind of have to pick them up hand pick them one at a time. And the seed yield can be a little mediocre, but once you've got seed, they're easy to grow. Eriogonum corymbosum. This is one of my favorite buckwheats, and it grows in warmer places in southern Wyoming, if you consider any of Wyoming to be warmer, down through Utah into northern Arizona and a few other places in spotty places in New Mexico and Colorado. But this is a very, very interesting plant in that it'll grow in such a dense sphere that you actually can't push your hand down into it when it's about ready to go into bloom. It's just kind of like a wire globe. And this particular plant is in my yard, and it actually is not as dense. This particular plant is not as dense as many of the forms of it that I have grown, but it's the same. And you take off all the old inflorescences from last year. It grows new ones from this year, and it just grows from sticks. Basically, looks like sticks, and then it develops this wire net, and then it starts to bloom. And here it usually is late October. Mid-October at least before it starts to bloom, and then it blooms well past last frost. And again, because of that real unique flowering period, it's a pollinator magnet, and what a wonderful, beautiful plant. And then in many forms of it, after it blooms, and you go into winter, I leave the old inflorescences on it into spring because they take on a real kind of a coppery color, and they're actually very, very beautiful against the snow. So anyway, I have a hard time getting enough seed of it. Sometimes it's just, I think it disperses its seed easily and you lose a lot of it on the ground, and you just can't get at it. But anyway, but there's also a yellow form of it that comes out of Utah, just as attractive, just as interesting. Cespitosum is the one that I showed when I showed that picture of the high elevation buckwheat, and it grows in kind of the central and southern Rocky Mountain areas, and at high elevations usually again. But I do have it growing very close to me. I live at just over 4,000 feet, and we live not very far from the craters of the moon. And we have a lot of bare acreages of just lava rocks, and they like to grow right on those lava rocks with nothing else around them. But this is what it looks like in bloom. One of the interesting things about it, but also one of the things that makes it a little more difficult to manage, is that it has dioecious habit. In other words, it has male plants and female plants. This is a female plant with a kind of reddish and orangish color to the flowers. The male flowers are yellow and on shorter stems, and only the female will produce seed. So that makes it a little more complicated to get exactly what you want, but I find it to be a minor nuisance. It's a great plant. And Eriogonum wrightii, this is the last one, and then I'm going to very quickly cover a few things that we need to know about them to grow them. But it's called bastard sage. It's comes mostly out of California and a little bit into Nevada, and it's pink, kind of beautiful plant. And this one really will spread a lot from seed. And where I planted a couple of plants, now I have like about 40 or 50 plants, and I hoe some out every year, but I don't care because it's really pretty, and the pollinators love it again because it's a late bloomer. So if you want to grow buckwheat seeds, you can, if you want to grow buckwheats, you can find a few buckwheat species and a few forms of it growing as specialty nurseries. But a lot of these, but it's largely umbulatum and maybe a little bit of ovalifolium and a few other plants. And it's hard to find the local ones at all. So anyway, go out and look for buckwheats, pre-scout populations, monitor the bloom period, go back when the blooms are dry but not yet falling off, or have a dry touch feel to them as you touch them. They'll actually stay on the plant for quite a while in a dry stage, and then collect some seed, but adhere to that 10-10 rule that was explained to you earlier. Only 10% of the seed off of 10% of the plants. Remove mostly dry heads, place them in a paper bag, and put them in a dry place for 2 to 3 weeks before you try to rub the seed out. And again, as was explained, you may need to get permission on some federal properties to collect. Those are policy and regulation issues, not so much law issues, but still, especially the Forest Service in many places would like you to have have permission to collect so that they can know what's going on in their in the lands that they manage. The seed is always stuck to the old flowers, old dried flowers, and you have to kind of completely rub away the dried flowers to get at the seeds. And you can just plant the dried flowers. In fact, that's how the flowers spread themselves. The dried flowers fall off the ball of dried flowers, and then they just roll across the ground, and then that's how they disperse seeds from the wind. Also, a number of insects and like ants and small mammals carry them around to disperse them. But if you want to see what you've got and you want to know you have good seed, rub it away. You can do it with your hand. You can do it between a couple of sponges. If you're just doing a few handfuls of seed, then you can just blow the chaff away, and then you'll see these kind of teardrop shaped seeds. If you want to just get seed, join the Eriogonum Society. I belong to this organization because they have a seed exchange. And if you belong to this society, and it's like $15, $20 a year or something, and then they also have an annual meeting at really interesting places you might want to go to see new buckwheats. And they publish some materials and do other things. But anyway, the seed exchange is a big reason to belong to them. And a lot of people from a lot of places in the West will put seed into the exchange, and you can purchase it for like $1 an envelope or something. And then you can get all kinds of buckwheats that you may not be able to collect yourself. And I put this is recorded, so if you want to go back and find that website for the Eriogonum Society, you can find that, and you can actually join online if you want. Planting buckwheats, am I okay to take a few extra minutes?
Yes, please. You can't hear all the oohs and ahs, but yes.
Okay, I'm trying to hurry, but I spent a little too much time on stuff at the first that I probably should have spent less time on. Anyway, after you have seed, most of the buckwheats will grow better if they're stratified for 3 weeks. Now, what's stratification? That's the process of exposing the seeds to cold, moist conditions for a period of time. And basically, and if you do that artificially, you're basically faking the plant out, the seed out, and making it think that it has gone through a winter and now it's spring and it's ready to grow. You can do that by putting them in some moist peat moss in a baggie, put them in the refrigerator for 3 weeks, and then bring them out and plant them. Or you can just plant them in a flat, or plant them 2 or 3 at a seed in several pots, 2 or 3 in each pot, and then set them outside toward the end of winter into early spring and let them kind of naturally get stratified. But however you do it, they will grow better if you do that. Then you plant them, and like any other native plant, you'll need to water them every 2 or 3 days for a couple of weeks, and every week for a little while longer, and a few times even toward the end of the year, even if they're looking good and growing good. But minimal irrigation. They don't like to be wet. They don't like to, you can't plant them in a place that's a low spot where water might collect from your irrigation systems or other things like that. They need to be in a full sun, well-drained spot to do their best. And then finally, use potting, and minimal irrigation also goes for in the pot. Don't just irrigate them every day when they're growing in the pot and you haven't planted them outside yet. Kind of touch the top of the soil, let it get dry down to about a 1/4 inch underneath the soil before you water them, and then just wait till it dries again each time. And by doing that, you should be able to manage it. They are very prone to damping off if you get too much water too often in the pot, so be careful of that. And in the pot, use sterile potting soil. Don't use soil that's come from your garden, because they're very prone to situations where there might be pathogens in the soil that are very common in your garden. And so anyway, use something sterile, some soil, and you can plant them in peat-based soil. Just make sure they don't get watered too much and they're too wet all the time. Or you can plant them in something that's made of grit or other things as well. Out in the garden, plant these plants with other drought-tolerant species. Like I said, here in Aberdeen, I've not watered them at all and had them be just fine, but they will look more attractive with periodic irrigation. And by periodic, I mean, I think my buckwheats are the happiest when I water them between 4 and 5 times a year. My first watering irrigation is usually in early June. My last one is usually in late August, and then 3 or 4 irrigations in between, or 2 or 3 irrigations in between. And so it's not much, but that's enough, and they will be really, really happy. Again, I talked about drainage. When you do irrigate fairly deeply, put 2 or 3 inches of water on so that water will get down to the root zone, and then they have something to utilize until your next infrequent irrigation. Just some keys to buckwheat plant care. Remove the dead leaves and branches in the spring just to beautify them and get them ready for a summer of beauty. And prune them for size control. Basically, if they get a little too big and are growing out of their space, you can reach back into the plants and cut branches off and reduce the size. Deadhead them after bloom, and again, that's a beauty thing. It's not really something that you have to do. They won't really grow better because of it, but they will look better. And then again, that occasional deep irrigation. So I'm done. Go buckwheats. Everybody plant buckwheats.
Everyone missed the earlier. Yeah, they won't be sorry. Everyone missed the earlier conversation where I think everyone who is organizing this call is slightly obsessed with buckwheats. So we were very excited to hear your presentation was going to focus on those. Absolutely gorgeous. And Alyssa, I know we have to have some great questions for Dr. Love.
We do, yes. Let's start with this one. Does growing natives for seeds in a nursery where they're watered and soil might be better than its natural habitat make the plants less drought tolerant or less hardy in other ways?
No. Only during the process of growing those plants out and managing them, if they're grown in a greenhouse, they're grown under fairly ideal conditions, then the tissue on that plant, when it comes out, it'll be like any other, if you're planting out tomatoes or putting transplants into your garden or whatever, when they come out of the greenhouse, they will be less drought tolerant. They will be not quite as able to withstand tough conditions. But most of these plants don't even have the genes in their populations to be not drought tolerant. And so you aren't going to change even if they're grown over and over in a greenhouse, they really don't have the genetic makeup to not be drought tolerant. And so you're not going to change that much, if at all. And so just because they've been grown in a greenhouse, once you get it out, you get it established, they start some new growth. Now they're put under the conditions that you want them to grow under, which hopefully is fairly low water conditions. They will very quickly revert back to growing tissue that allows them to be drought tolerant. But it's like any other plant. Once you first put them out, they're not really very drought tolerant. You can not water them for a couple of days too long, and they will wilt and die. But it doesn't take them very long to revert back to a very drought tolerant condition.
More great information. Thank you. We've got a question here. Is there a list of the domesticated wild plants and where we can get them?
The ones that we've been working on, again, all of those are commercialized through this nursery called Native Roots. And they have a website, and if you type in Native Roots LLC, that's Limited Liability Corporation, LLC, and then maybe you might even need to put Twin Falls in your search, and that will be what comes up. And they have descriptions of the plants and a way to contact them if you. They don't mail order plants, but if you want to make a time to maybe go one time to go visit them and buy some plants or something, you can. However, that Plants of the Wild also has, that is in Eastern Washington, has a website as well. And like I said, they grow a significant number. They don't grow every species that we've given to Native Roots, but they grow a significant number of them. And so that would be an easier trip for you. And I think they do some shipping. At least they did the last time that I was there visiting, which has been a couple of years. But it would also be an easy drive for most of you.
Yeah. And Plants of the Wild is, along with all of the regional vendors that they do business with, is on our vendor list on our website, hgcd.info. So you can find that information there. They ship. And so, yes, it's a great resource to get some of these buckwheats.
Okay, any other questions?
Great. There are. Do we have time, Heather, to go through a few more questions?
Yeah, let's capture a couple more while we have Dr. Love before we sign off today.
Great. Do the plants you release to the nurseries have a variable name or some other way to identify them as coming from domesticated seeds versus wild seeds?
They don't. However, they are labeled as Native Roots. And so, and Native Roots puts the information on how the plants came about in many of the things that they publish or on their website. And so they are labeled as Native Roots, and so you would know that. But no, in fact, the people that run Native Roots have purposely not put any cultivar names on them because they don't consider them to be truly hybridized cultivars. In fact, they aren't. They're just barely domesticated. and so they're more like wild plants, even though they're not. And some people might, you know, if you're a real wild plant connoisseur, then Native Roots plants might not be the way you want to go. Then you're probably limited mostly to, at this point in time now, mostly to collecting your own and producing your own. Although there are a few nurseries that are growing plants. But here's the issue again. This domestication process does change the genetic component of the plant just a little bit. It has to. I mean, you're selecting for a specific type. But just the process of people growing seed and not actually going out and collecting it in the wild, once you put a plant in a garden, it's going through the domestication process, whether you're doing it on purpose or not. and we just do it on purpose. And so unless you're actually going out on the mountainside and collecting your own seed or buying from somebody who did that, you're not going to get seed that hasn't been at least partially domesticated.
Great, thank you. Got a couple of these questions might have come in. Well, this one especially may have come in before you were showing the map. But can you think of any species, buckwheat species, that are specific to the riverbanks of the Columbia?
You know, I haven't spent enough time there. And you're talking about mostly through the gorge or mostly farther north?
I'm not sure. I would guess further north.
Okay. Actually, I know that rock buckwheat would be there. It won't be in any place that's damp, and it likes the scabland areas, but it's there. It's there. I know it's there. Trying to think what the snow buckwheat will be there.
Yep. Yep.
The strictum might be there. The strict buckwheat. And I think the yellow form of ovalifolium, the oval leaf buckwheat, will often grow down in the valley floors. So maybe you'd find it. Of the ones I showed, that's probably, and I showed the best ones, the ones that I felt had the best potential for use in landscapes that are very local there. So you can go through that list again.
Great. Thank you. And then jumping over the mountains here, any buckwheats adaptable for sunny, dry Puget Sound shorelines?
You know what?
Too far.
You're probably pushing it. However, if you're on the west side of Puget Sound, where you're in the rain shadow, buckwheats will grow very well there.
Okay.
When you get to the east side and start to where the rain shadow is disappearing as you move back up into the Cascades, it will be difficult. There are some buckwheats, Pyrifolium, Eriogonum pyrifolium. I don't know the common name of it, but it actually grows in the damper areas of the Cascades where there's open ground. The one problem with that one is I have never been able to get it to grow from seed. And so if you're better than me at that, take a shot at it, but it might be one. And some of these buckwheats are not going to do well there at all. But some of these buckwheats grow where in the wintertime, they might be under 5 feet of snow and it might be damp clear into, midsummer. And so I think if you provide them with the right conditions, maybe do some soil amending, give them some very well-drained, very sunny conditions that especially some of those that are come from higher elevations might do okay.
Okay. Sounds like some things to check out. And Heather recommends checking the Burke herbarium page. Great recommendation. Got a question here asking, what is the soil type around your house?
It's a silt loam, pH of 8.5. Not true clay, not a real heavy clay, but has some of the same characteristics as clays because it's a very fine silt that makes up our soil. It's low S. It's a lot like the soils you have from Yakima West, alkaline, rough, almost no organic matter.
Right. Yep. Sounds familiar. Okay, and then we have a question here. I think it was the slide before the one with the wood chips and the, as you called them, the invasive buckwheats that were being spread by you, which I just really enjoyed that piece. But I think it was a slide before. They love the plants in your yard. Would you please identify the other plants?
Oh gosh.
Or maybe
Actually,
just a few of the outstanding ones.
In my garden, I grow a lot of buckwheats and I grow a lot of penstemons. But I think I've got 250 species of plants in that garden that I showed the picture of.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of different stuff. The only thing that I don't grow much anymore that I used to grow more of is lupins, and that's mostly because I got tired of trying to keep them going. They just don't live very long. But you know, I've got all kinds of all kinds of things in the aster family, the asters and daisies, and heucheras, lots of heucheras. Love heucheras, and they won't grow in a garden that you don't water at all. But there's some pretty good drought-tolerant heucheras, even though we kind of consider them to be shady wet plants. But a lot of our native Western heucheras are not that way. Anyway, what else have I got? I got some trees, I got some shrubs, I got some syringa, I've got some currants, I've got bristlecone and flexulis, Pinus flexulis, what's it called? Anyway, I memorized scientific names and I can't remember the common names. Anyway, it's a pine that has real soft needles and soft branches.
Very nice.
So anyway, I've got a bunch of stuff.
Wonderful.
Well, that's amazing. Well, Dr. Love, thank you again for an amazing presentation and for sharing your time with us. We're just so excited we were able to have you. And like I said, you're preaching to the buckwheat loving choir here.
Well, I'm sorry I took so long, but I hope it was interesting. If it's interesting, then it doesn't matter.
That's correct. Absolutely. Well, with that, I think we should wrap things up so we can get everyone outside in their gardens and so they can go for a hike this afternoon. On behalf of myself and my partners in crime at the Heritage Garden Program, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Like we said before, this presentation has been recorded and we will post it next week on our Facebook page and on our website. And until next time, we will either see you in the garden or online, but get out and enjoy this beautiful spring weather, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yes.
And
thank you, everyone.
Yes,
Great
thank you.
presentation.
Great.
Happy birthday, Heather.
Thank you. What a wonderful way to spend my birthday. I couldn't think of a better way.
Yeah.
Right. Take care, everyone.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.